There is something that the first European explorers wrote about in their journals that almost nobody teaches in history class. Not the descriptions of coastlines or the measurements of rivers or the accounts of weather and wildlife. Something else. Something that kept appearing in the private letters and the official reports and the personal diaries of men who had crossed an ocean to find a new world and instead found evidence that someone had been here long before them, building things that should not have existed, leaving behind structures and earthworks and artifacts that did not fit any category of civilization these explorers had been prepared to encounter. Some of them wrote about it in careful, measured language, the language of men trying to be taken seriously. Others wrote about it in ways that suggested they were genuinely disturbed by what they were seeing, not frightened of the people they met, frightened of the evidence those people had inherited without fully understanding it themselves. This is a slow story. It moves the way rivers move, which is forward and with purpose but without urgency, finding the path of least resistance through the landscape of what we think we know. If you are settling in right now, adjusting whatever it is you adjust before the long drift begins, then you are in exactly the right place for this. Nothing here requires you to stay alert. Nothing here will suddenly demand your attention in the way that things designed to startle you demand attention. This is a story for the hours when the mind loosens its grip on the day and becomes available for something older and quieter and stranger than the ordinary. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. The first thing to understand is that the explorers were not easily frightened men. The ones who made it across the Atlantic in the 16th century, who navigated the rivers of the interior in the 17th, who pushed through the mountain passes and into the deep wilderness of the continent in the 18th, were self-selected for a quality that was not exactly courage but was adjacent to it. A tolerance for the unknown, an ability to function in circumstances where almost nothing was familiar, and where the gap between what they had been taught to expect and what they actually found was wide enough to swallow a lesser person's sense of self. Entirely. These men had seen things that challenged their understanding of the world. They had encountered peoples and customs and natural phenomena that had no equivalent in their experience or their education. They were, by and large, capable of taking extraordinary things in stride. And so when something they encountered did not just surprise them but genuinely disturbed them, it is worth paying attention to what that something was. What they kept finding, in the valleys and on the plains and along the river systems of the interior of North America, was evidence of construction. Not simple construction, not the kind of shelters and fish weirs and cleared fields that they expected to find, and did find, among the peoples they met, but something else entirely. Earthworks of a scale that had no parallel in anything they had seen in Europe outside of the greatest Roman engineering projects. Mounds that rose from the flat plains like artificial mountains, geometric enclosures covering areas of hundreds of acres, laid out with a precision that implied knowledge of mathematics and surveying that these explorers associated with their own most advanced civilizations. Roads, in some places, broad and straight and built to a standard that suggested not just travel but intention. The intention of a society that thought of itself as permanent, that built its infrastructure to last, that expected the future to use what it had constructed. And the people they met, the nations they encountered in those same valleys and plains and along those same river systems, did not always build these things. In many cases they lived near them, used them, incorporated them into their own ceremonial and practical lives. But they did not always know who had made them. The oldest ones, the most ambitious ones, the ones that most disturbed the explorers, were sometimes already ancient when the peoples of the contact era encountered them, were sometimes spoken of, in the oral traditions of those peoples, as having been made by others, by people who came before, by a time before the current age of the world, by builders whose identity had been absorbed into myth and whose specific history had been replaced by something that was true in a different way than historical fact is true, but that was not the same as historical fact. The explorers wrote this down. They wrote down what the peoples they met told them about who had made the great mounds and earthworks and roads. They wrote down their own assessments of whether what they were seeing could have been produced by the peoples currently living in the region. And in many cases, they concluded that it could not, that the scale and the precision and the apparent age of what they were looking at implied a different order of civilization than what they currently observed. A civilization that had existed, flourished, and in some fundamental way disappeared, leaving behind only its most durable constructions as evidence of what it had been. That conclusion made them uncomfortable. It made them uncomfortable for reasons that were partly scientific, in the sense that it implied a history of the continent that nothing in their education had prepared them for. And it made them uncomfortable for reasons that were partly existential, in the sense that evidence of a great civilization that had risen and fallen in a land they were claiming to be discovering implied that discovery was perhaps not quite the right word for what they were doing. The science of what they saw has progressed enormously since those first encounters. We now have radiocarbon dating and satellite imagery and LiDAR surveys and genetic analysis and all the other tools that modern archaeology brings to the question of who built what and when. And what those tools have revealed over the past century and especially over the past few decades has not made the story simpler. It has made it more remarkable, more complex, more interesting, and in some ways more disturbing than even the most unsettled of those early explorers could have imagined. The city that no one taught you about in school is in Illinois, or rather, it was in Illinois, and its ghost is still there, in the shape of the land and in the scale of the earthen monuments that remain. It was called Cahokia, and at its height, around the year 1100 of the Common Era, it was larger than any city in Europe with the possible exception of London. Not slightly larger, significantly larger. Cahokia at its peak had an estimated population of between 10 and 20,000 people living within the city's core, with additional populations spread across a broader metropolitan area that may have contained as many as 40,000 people in total. This was not a village. This was not a settlement. This was a city, in every sense that matters. A planned, dense, hierarchically organized urban center with specialized labor and long-distance trade networks and monumental public architecture, and all the other features that define civilization as we tend to use that word. The centerpiece of Cahokia was a structure called Monk's Mound. It is still standing. You can visit it. It rises in 4 broad terraces to a height of about 30 meters, and its base covers an area of approximately 14 hectares, which makes it larger at the base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It is the largest pre-Columbian structure north of Mexico. It was built entirely of earth, basket by basket, over a period of several centuries, by a population that had organized itself to move millions of cubic meters of soil in the creation of a monument that was clearly intended to be permanent. That was clearly intended to say something about the civilization that built it that would outlast any individual lifetime. That was intended to be seen from a great distance and to communicate to anyone approaching the city that something significant was here. The Grand Plaza that stretched south from Monk's Mound was roughly the size of 35 American football fields. It was flat and carefully maintained and served as the civic center of the city, the place where the public life of this extraordinary society was conducted. Around the plaza and across the city, more than 100 smaller mounds were built, each serving different functions. Some were platforms for temples or elite residences, some were burial mounds, some were markers in the ceremonial landscape of the city, their positions and orientations calculated in relation to each other and to the movements of the sun. The whole complex was laid out according to a plan that is still not fully understood, but that clearly reflects a sophisticated understanding of geometry and astronomy and urban organization. The people who built this city are called the Mississippians. They were not a single ethnic group or a single language community, but a cultural tradition that spread across much of eastern North America from about 800 to 1,600 of the Common Era. At its peak, Mississippian civilization encompassed dozens of cities and hundreds of smaller settlements, connected by trade routes that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes, from the Atlantic coast to the Great Plains. The trade goods that have been found in Mississippian archaeological contexts come from as far away as the Rocky Mountains and the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic seaboard. Copper from the Lake Superior region, marine shells from the Gulf, mica from the Appalachians, shirt from the Ozarks. This was not a local or regional phenomenon. This was a continental trading system, maintained by a civilization that was, by any reasonable measure, advanced. But Cahokia was not the only great center. It was not even necessarily the most remarkable. The Mississippian world was studded with places that the first European explorers encountered and wrote about in terms that combined wonder and unease. Moundville in Alabama, which was a major regional center, with a population and complexity second only to Cahokia. Etowah in Georgia, whose large platform mounds and surrounding palisade walls were encountered by the survivors of the Hernando de Soto expedition in the 1540s. Spiro in Oklahoma, which served as a major ceremonial center and trading hub whose artifacts were so extraordinary that when it was excavated, partially by looters in the 1930s, the objects that came out of it shook the archaeological community's assumptions about what pre-Columbian North American civilization was capable of producing. The Spiro site deserves a longer moment, because what was found there, in a burial mound that had been constructed over many generations and that contained the accumulated ritual wealth of one of the great centers of Mississippian civilization, was not what anyone expected to find in a North American archaeological context. Elaborate copper plates with intricate figurative imagery, embossed shell gorgets of extraordinary artistic sophistication, textiles that had somehow survived in the dry conditions of the mound interior, including one piece that was described by the archaeologists, who eventually examined the site formally as among the finest examples of pre-Columbian textile art in North America. Carved wooden figures, ceremonial batons, objects that had been brought to Spiro from hundreds of kilometers away, from cultures that should, according to the conventional understanding of pre-Columbian North America, have had no regular connection with each other. The looters who broke into the Great Mortuary Mound at Spiro in 1933 and 1934, before the site came under archaeological protection, sold what they found on the antiquities market, and the objects ended up scattered across collections in the United States and Europe. What this means is that the most remarkable archaeological assemblage ever discovered in North America north of Mexico was partially destroyed before it could be properly studied. What it also means is that the objects that did reach museum collections became known to researchers who were then forced to revise their understanding of what Mississippian civilization had been capable of. The revision has not been complete. It has not been as thorough or as public or as widely disseminated as it should be, given what the evidence demands. The standard story of pre-Columbian North America, the one taught in most schools and presented in most popular media, is still largely the story that was constructed in the 19th century and that served the political purposes of justifying European conquest and settlement of a continent that was, according to that story, effectively empty, populated by simple, wandering, non-civilizational peoples who had not developed the kind of social complexity that would entitle them to the land they inhabited. That story is wrong. The evidence that it is wrong has been accumulating for more than a century, and yet the story persists, because stories that serve power tend to persist even after the evidence against them has become overwhelming. The evidence against it is overwhelming. It is overwhelming not just because of Cahokia and Spiro and Moundville and the other great Mississippian centers. It is overwhelming because of what existed before the Mississippians. Because the Mississippians, extraordinary as they were not the beginning of the story. They were one chapter in a story that goes back much, much further. And the chapters before them are, in some ways, even more remarkable than the Mississippian achievement itself. The Hopewell tradition is the chapter that immediately precedes the Mississippian, and that, in some ways, dwarfs it in terms of the sheer ambition of its earthwork construction. Hopewell flourished primarily from about 100 BCE to about 500 CE, a period of 6 centuries during which the peoples of the Ohio River Valley and the surrounding regions built geometric earthwork complexes of a scale and precision that still defy easy explanation. The Newark earthworks in Ohio, which survives only partially due to centuries of agricultural and urban development, was originally the largest earthwork complex in the world, not in North America, in the world. Its geometric enclosures, when complete, covered an area of more than 4 square miles. Its circles and squares and octagons were laid out with a precision, confirmed by modern survey, that matched the sophistication of the best surveying possible in ancient Rome or ancient Egypt. The octagon at Newark is aligned to the moonrise at the lunar standstill, the point in the 18-year cycle of the moon when it rises at its most extreme northern position. This is a subtle astronomical event that requires sustained observation over many years to identify, and that requires precise geometric knowledge to build toward. The people who built Newark were paying attention to the sky in a way that implies a tradition of astronomical observations stretching back generations. They were building structures that encoded that astronomical knowledge in earthen geometry on a scale that is still visible from the air today, though most of what was once there has been ploughed under or built over. What remains is enough to make you stop and recalibrate your assumptions about what was happening in the Ohio River Valley 2,000 years ago. And Newark was not unique. The Hopewell Earthwork Complex at Mound City in Ohio, now part of Hopewell Culture National Historical Park, was another major ceremonial center. The Fort Ancient Earthworks in Warren County, Ohio, enclosing an area of more than 3 square miles on a high ridge overlooking the Little Miami River, represented one of the largest hilltop enclosures anywhere in the ancient world. The Poverty Point site in Louisiana, which is actually considerably older than the Hopewell tradition, dating to roughly 1700 to 1100 BCE, consisted of a series of concentric curved earthen ridges surrounding a large ceremonial plaza, the whole complex covering nearly a square mile and representing an estimated 35 million basket loads of earth moved by hand. 35 million basket loads. That number deserves to sit with you for a moment. Moving dirt is not complicated work, but it requires people, and organizing large numbers of people to move dirt requires something beyond just having people available. It requires motivation. It requires coordination. It requires a social structure that can direct collective effort over extended periods of time toward a shared purpose. It requires, in short, something that we would recognize as a functioning civilization. An organized society with institutions and leadership and shared values, and the capacity to mobilize resources on a significant scale. Poverty Point had all of that. The site is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, belatedly recognized for what the evidence has long suggested it was, one of the most significant and most ancient complex societies in North American history. The people who built it were doing so more than 3,000 years ago, at a time when ancient Egypt was at the height of the New Kingdom, at a time when the great palace cultures of the Aegean were collapsing into the Bronze Age Dark Ages, at a time when most of what would become the great civilizations of the Old World were still centuries from their peak achievements. The people of the lower Mississippi Valley were building a ceremonial and trading center of remarkable sophistication. And before Poverty Point, that is where the story gets significantly harder to tell and significantly more interesting, because the earthwork tradition of Eastern North America does not appear suddenly with Poverty Point. It has precursors, older sites that show the beginnings of the tradition, the first experiments with organized earthen construction, the earliest evidence of the kind of social complexity that eventually produced the mounds and enclosures of the Hopewell and Mississippian periods. Watson Brake in Louisiana is one of those precursors. It consists of 11 mounds connected by a low ridge, enclosing an oval of about 900 feet in diameter. It was dated, when it was finally properly excavated and analyzed in the 1990s, to approximately 3,400 BCE, nearly 5,500 years ago. This makes it older than the oldest phase of Stonehenge, older than the Great Pyramids of Egypt, the oldest known earthwork complex in the Americas, and one of the oldest in the world, and it is sitting in the wetlands of northern Louisiana, relatively little known, visited by few tourists, the subject of no major popular history books or documentary series aimed at a general audience. Why not? That is a question worth asking. Why is Watson Brake not famous? Why is Poverty Point not famous in the way that comparable sites in the Old World are famous? Why is Cahokia not as well known to the average American as the Colosseum in Rome or the Parthenon in Athens? The answer to that question is partly logistical and partly political, and both parts of the answer are uncomfortable. The logistical part is that earthen architecture does not photograph as dramatically as stone architecture. A mound of earth, however large, does not have the visual impact of a stone pyramid or a marble temple. The thing that makes Monk's Mound remarkable, its sheer volume and the organizational achievement it represents, is not visible in a photograph the way the Great Pyramid's visual drama is immediately apparent. You have to understand what you are looking at to appreciate it. You have to know what the numbers mean, and that kind of understanding requires education. The political part is that making these sites famous, making the story of pre-Columbian North American civilization a standard part of public education and popular culture, would require an honest reckoning with what was lost and how it was lost and whose decisions and whose violence produced the loss. The great civilizations of Eastern North America were not simply absorbed into the European colonial world. They were destroyed. The Mississippian city-states were broken by the violence and the disease that followed European contact. The populations that maintained the knowledge traditions and the ceremonial practices that gave the mound complexes their meaning were killed or displaced or forced to abandon those practices under colonial pressure. And the monuments themselves, the mounds and enclosures and earthwork complexes that represented millennia of organized social effort, were largely plowed under by European-American agriculture in the 18th and 19th centuries, their soil incorporated into the fields that fed the new nation. That destruction is a fact. It happened, and acknowledging it fully, in the way that making the mound builders famous would require, would mean placing the story of pre-Columbian civilization alongside the story of its destruction in a way that changes the moral character of the national origin narrative. It would mean admitting that what was here before was not simple and primitive and therefore acceptable to displace, but complex and sophisticated and flourishing, and therefore not acceptable to displace by any standard of justice. It would mean telling a more honest story about what America was and what it became and at what cost. Some of the first European explorers who encountered the evidence of what had been here were honest about this in their own way. They wrote what they saw, and what they saw troubled them, and the trouble showed in their words. The De Soto expedition of 1539 to 1543, which traveled through what is now the American Southeast and encountered numerous Mississippian towns and ceremonial centers, left accounts that make clear the observers understood they were moving through an ancient and sophisticated civilization, not what they found at the height of Cahokia, which had declined by the time Europeans arrived, but the remnants and the successors of that tradition, still functioning, still impressive, still clearly the product of a deep and organized social history. The accounts of that expedition describe towns surrounded by palisades, with large plazas and temple mounds, and chiefs who commanded respect over wide areas, and who received the Spanish expedition with the kind of ceremonial protocol that implies a highly developed culture of governance and diplomacy. The Spanish accounts describe populations in the hundreds of thousands in some of the regions they passed through, describe towns large enough that the army of several hundred soldiers could march through them for a full day without reaching the other side, describe a level of agricultural development, the clearance and cultivation of large areas around each settlement that implied a relationship with the land going back many generations. And then, in the following decades, those populations largely disappeared. The diseases that the De Soto expedition carried, and that other Spanish and later English and French expeditions brought with them, moved through the indigenous populations of eastern North America with a speed and lethality that was without precedent in recorded history. Estimates of the death toll from introduced diseases in the century following first contact range from 50 to 90% of the indigenous population in affected regions. In some areas, the death rate was even higher. Towns that the De Soto expedition had described as containing thousands of people were found, a generation later, to be abandoned or reduced to tiny remnants of their former populations. This is the mechanism by which the civilization the first explorers encountered was lost, not primarily by military conquest, though that played a role in some areas, not primarily by deliberate policy of extermination, though that too played a role at various times and places, but by disease, spreading faster than any human decision or action could control, killing at rates that no society could survive intact. What was left, in the wake of those epidemics, were the survivors of a civilization whose institutional structures and knowledge traditions and population base had been catastrophically reduced. Peoples who had been complex and organized and numerous were suddenly small and scattered and struggling simply to maintain biological survival. The mounds they had inherited, some of which they had built themselves and many of which they had received from their predecessors, remained. The civilization that had maintained and used them was gone. When European settlers moved into the interior of eastern North America in significant numbers in the 17th and 18th centuries, what they found was a landscape that had already been transformed by a century or more of epidemic disease. The populations they encountered were not what the continent had looked like before contact. The towns described by the De Soto expedition survivors did not exist. The great concentrations of people in the river valleys were gone. What remained was something much smaller and more fragmented. Peoples who had survived the catastrophe and were rebuilding under impossibly difficult conditions, but who no longer represented the full complexity of what pre-contact indigenous civilization in eastern North America had been. The settlers saw the mounds. They could not avoid seeing the mounds. The mounds were everywhere in the river valleys where settlement concentrated. In Ohio and Kentucky and Illinois and Missouri and Tennessee and Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana, wherever Europeans moved in significant numbers in the late 18th and 19th centuries, they encountered earthen mounds of every size, from small to enormous, and they had to explain them. They had to explain what they were and who had built them. And the explanation they developed was not that the ancestors of the people they were currently displacing had built them. That explanation was available. There was evidence for it. Some indigenous nations maintained oral traditions that associated them or their ancestors with the mound-building tradition. But that explanation was not adopted. Instead, American popular culture in the early 19th century produced the mound builder myth. The idea that the mounds had been built by a lost race, a mysterious pre-Indian civilization, a people of unknown origin who had inhabited North America long before the ancestors of the current indigenous nations arrived, who had achieved a high level of civilization, and who had been exterminated or driven out by the ancestors of the peoples Europeans were currently encountering. The mound builder myth was not a scientific hypothesis. It was a cultural narrative that served specific political purposes. If the mounds had been built by a mysterious lost race rather than by the ancestors of the current indigenous peoples, then the current indigenous peoples had no more historical connection to the mound sites than the European settlers did. The land was effectively unowned by any continuous historical tradition. The settlers were not displacing an ancient civilization. They were simply occupying land that had already been vacated by the real ancient civilization, whose identity was conveniently lost to history. This narrative was scientifically disproven by the early 20th century. The work of Cyrus Thomas, who directed a major survey of mound sites for the Smithsonian Institution in the 1890s, conclusively demonstrated that the mounds had been built by peoples ancestral to the historic tribes of the eastern United States. The evidence was clear, consistent, and overwhelming. The mound builder myth was wrong, but myths die slowly, especially myths that serve political purposes. The mound builder narrative persisted in popular culture well into the 20th century and continues to resurface periodically in books and television programs and internet content that presents it as a suppressed truth rather than a disproven theory. The persistence of the myth is itself a story about how deeply embedded in American cultural identity the need is to believe that the continent was essentially empty before European arrival, or that whatever had been here before had been destroyed by someone other than European settlers. The myth serves a psychological need. It offloads the moral weight of what happened onto a mysterious ancient conflict between unnamed ancient peoples, removing the specific responsibility of the actual history. The actual history is more interesting and more uncomfortable than the myth. The actual history is of a continent that was densely populated and complexly organized for thousands of years before European contact. A continent where civilizations rose and fell according to internal dynamics, where climate change and political fragmentation and ecological pressure and cultural transformation produce the rise and fall of specific cultural traditions over the centuries, just as they did in the Old World. Where the people who built Cahokia did not simply disappear because of some mysterious catastrophe, but went through a process of political decentralization and demographic dispersal that produced the diverse nations of the Mississippian and post-Mississippian periods. And where those nations, whatever their relationship to the great mound-building traditions, were themselves sophisticated and complex and deeply rooted in the landscape when European contact initiated the epidemic catastrophe that destroyed so much of what had existed. The first explorers who encountered the traces of all of this were, many of them, honest enough to record what they saw even when what they saw did not fit the story they were supposed to be telling. Their journals and letters and reports contain the raw material of a different understanding of American history, one that begins before 1492 and that does not treat the pre-Columbian past as a blank or a prelude, but as a history in its own right, as deep and as complex and as worthy of study and of honest reckoning as the history of any civilization anywhere in the world. The story of what they saw and what it meant is the story that this telling has been moving toward. And now that we have established the scale of what existed, now that the framework is in place for understanding what the first explorers were actually encountering, we can go deeper into the specifics, into the particular sites and the particular peoples and the particular moments when the encounter between the arriving Europeans and the surviving remnants of pre-Columbian civilization produced something that the historical record has preserved and that rewards careful attention. One of those moments happened in 1673, when Louis Joliet and Father Jacques Marquette descended the Mississippi River from the Great Lakes region and became the first Europeans to document the middle course of that great river. Their journey took them through landscapes that were already, by that time, reduced from what they had been a century earlier by the impact of introduced disease. But the landscape itself, the physical evidence of what had once been there, was still very much present. The account of their journey that Marquette left describes, among many other things, two extraordinary figures painted in red and green and black on the limestone bluffs above the river at a point south of the confluence of the Illinois River. The figures were large enough to be seen clearly from the river. They depicted beings that were not quite human and not quite animal, hybrid figures of a kind that Marquette, drawing on his European frame of reference, compared to demons or monsters. He described how the sight of them disturbed the native guides who were accompanying the expedition, guides who had insisted that no one could look at these figures without experiencing great misfortune. Marquette was educated and observant and not given to superstition of the European folk variety. He described what he saw carefully and without obvious embellishment. He was troubled by the figures, not because he believed in their supernatural power, but because they represented something he could not categorize within his understanding of what he was supposed to be finding in this landscape. Images that large, made with that degree of skill, in that exposed location, visible to anyone traveling the river, did not fit the picture of the people who were currently living along the river. They spoke of an artistic and ceremonial tradition of a different order than what he was observing among the peoples he was meeting. The figures he described are known today as the Piasa bird, and while the original paintings that Marquette described are long gone, destroyed by the same development and neglect that has erased so much of the pre-Columbian heritage of the region, replicas have been created based on his description and on other early accounts. The site is in the limestone bluffs above the Mississippi River near Alton, Illinois, and the story of the Piasa, preserved in the oral tradition of the Illini peoples who lived in the region at the time of European contact, speaks of a creature of enormous power that once preyed upon the people and that was eventually defeated by a great warrior chief. Whether the original paintings depicted this being or something else entirely, Whether the oral tradition connects to the paintings or represents a different tradition layered over a forgotten one is something that we cannot determine with certainty. What we can say is that Marquette's account of his encounter with those figures, and the unease the sight of them produced in everyone in his party, is one of the clearest moments in the historical record where the encounter between arriving Europeans and the deep legacy of pre-Columbian civilization produced a genuine and documented disturbance of ordinary expectation. That disturbance is the thread running through all of these early accounts, not the wonder of finding a new world, which was the official narrative of exploration, but the unease of finding evidence that something extraordinary had been here before, that the new world was not new, that the land being claimed for discovery had been fully occupied and actively shaped by human civilization for a very long time, and that the scale and sophistication of that civilization was, in some respects, comparable to or exceeding what the explorers carried with them, as their model of what civilization meant. The Ohio River was a particularly rich source of these unsettling encounters. The Valley of the Ohio, which drains an enormous area of what is now the eastern United States, was one of the heartlands of Hopewell civilization, and the earthwork complexes that the Hopewell tradition had constructed there were still substantially intact when European settlers began moving through the region in numbers in the late 18th century. The accounts these settlers left of what they found in the Ohio Valley form one of the most remarkable bodies of documentation about pre-Columbian North American civilization that exists. Even though much of it was written by people who are not archaeologists and who brought to their observations all the biases and limitations of their time, Caleb Atwater was one of the most important of these observers. He was a postmaster in Circleville, Ohio, in the early 19th century, and he spent years systematically documenting the earthworks of the Ohio Valley before agricultural development had destroyed most of them. His descriptions of what he found are methodical and detailed, and in many cases represent the only surviving record of sites that no longer exist. He measured the mounds, he mapped the enclosures, he described the artifacts he found in and around the earthworks, and he reached conclusions that the professional archaeologists who came after him had to take seriously even when they disagreed with his interpretations. What Atwater found, in site after site across the Ohio Valley, was evidence of a level of engineering precision that he found difficult to attribute to the peoples currently living in the region, not because he considered those peoples incapable of precision in principle, but because the specific kind of precision he was documenting, the surveyed geometric alignments, the calculated astronomical orientations, the graded and compacted earthen construction techniques, required a body of specialized knowledge that had to be accumulated over generations and maintained through institutional structures that the smaller-scale societies of the contact era did not clearly possess. He was right, in the sense that what he was documenting was genuinely remarkable. The geometric earthwork enclosures of the Hopewell tradition do show a level of surveying accuracy that was not explained by any technology known to have been used by pre-contact North American peoples. The circles are true circles, not approximations. The squares are true squares, not roughly rectangular enclosures. The alignments between distant features of the same complex are precise to a degree that requires either very sophisticated survey tools or very sophisticated observational and mathematical methods, or both. How this level of precision was achieved is a question that archaeologists are still working on. That it was achieved is not in question. One of the most striking examples is the High Bank Works near Chillicothe, Ohio, which consists of a large circle and a large octagon connected by parallel walls. The octagon is oriented so that each of its 8 sides is aligned to a different lunar rise or set position within the 6-year lunar cycle. To build this, the builders had to observe the moon's rising and setting positions over at least one complete lunar cycle, probably several. They had to identify the positions of maximum northern and southern displacement. They had to translate those observed positions into compass bearings, and from those bearings into the lines of an octagon drawn on the ground at a scale of several hundred meters. And then they had to build the earthen walls on those lines accurately enough that the astronomical alignments are still demonstrable today. This is a feat of astronomical observation, mathematics, and engineering. By any definition that does not specifically require a particular material technology or a particular institutional form, it is a civilizational achievement. It is the product of a sophisticated, organized, knowledge-preserving society. That society is the one that some of the first explorers of the Ohio Valley were encountering the remains of and finding so difficult to categorize. It did not fit their expected categories because their expected categories were derived from the civilizations of the Old World, which had developed along different lines with different emphases and different material technologies. The Hopewell civilization did not build in stone. It did not develop writing in any form we have yet recognized. It did not produce the kind of urban density that characterized Old World cities of comparable organizational complexity. What it produced instead was earthwork architecture of extraordinary ambition and precision, a continental trading network of remarkable reach, a ceremonial art tradition of great sophistication, and a way of organizing large-scale social effort that persisted for 6 centuries and left marks on the landscape that are still legible today, 2,000 years later. That is not nothing. That is one of the most significant and most underappreciated chapters in the human story on this continent. The trade networks of the Hopewell tradition are worth dwelling on, because they are perhaps the clearest evidence that what was happening in the Ohio Valley during those 6 centuries was not local or regional, but continental in scale. The objects found in Hopewell burial contexts come from sources that span the entire continent. Obsidian from Yellowstone, over 3,000 kilometers from the Ohio Valley heartland. Grizzly bear teeth from the Rocky Mountains, nearly as far. Copper from the Lake Superior region, brought south and east. Mica from the southern Appalachians, brought north and west. Alligator teeth from the Gulf Coast. Shells from the Atlantic and the Gulf. Shark teeth from the oceans. These objects did not move by accident. They moved because there were networks of exchange connecting communities across enormous distances, networks that were maintained over centuries, and that required ongoing relationships of trust and reciprocity between communities that in some cases had no direct contact with each other. They moved along routes that had been traveled long enough to become established corridors of communication and exchange. They moved as the carriers of meaning as much as the carriers of material value, because the objects themselves, in the ceremonial contexts where they were deposited, carried significance that transcended their practical utility. A grizzly bear tooth in an Ohio burial mound represents a connection to the Rocky Mountain West that no Ohioan of the Hopewell period had personally experienced. It represents the existence of a chain of relationships stretching from the Ohio Valley to the mountains, a chain that someone had maintained with sufficient care to bring that tooth all the way to its final resting place in a burial mound on the banks of the Ohio River. It represents, in a very concrete way, the knowledge that the world was larger than the immediate community, and that relationships with distant places and peoples were worth maintaining and worth marking. That knowledge is a civilizational achievement in itself, the capacity to think beyond the local, to maintain relationships across distances that require multiple intermediaries, to build and sustain the kind of trust that long-distance trade requires. These are not the characteristics of simple, isolated, resource-following bands. These are the characteristics of complex societies that have been developing their institutions and their networks for a very long time. The Hopewell tradition ended around 500 CE. Why it ended is one of the ongoing debates of North American archaeology. There is no single catastrophic event that explains it, no invasion or drought or disease that can be pointed to as the cause. What the evidence suggests is a combination of factors: climatic shifts that affected agricultural productivity, political fragmentation, as the costs of maintaining the extensive trade networks began to outweigh the benefits, internal social tensions within the hierarchical structures that the Hopewell tradition depended on, and possibly the emergence of new social forms that were better adapted to the changing conditions. What came after was not nothing. The centuries between the end of Hopewell and the rise of Mississippian civilization roughly 500 to 800 CE, saw a period of transformation rather than collapse, with populations dispersing and reorganizing and developing new approaches to the challenges of life in eastern North America. And then, from that transformation, emerged the Mississippian tradition, which built on the Hopewell legacy in some ways while departing from it in others, and which produced Cahokia and the other great platform mound cities that the De Soto expedition encountered at the height of their development. The Mississippians did not see themselves as continuing a tradition, in the sense that they probably did not have a clear historical consciousness of Hopewell civilization. 6 centuries had passed. The earthworks of the Hopewell era were old monuments in a landscape that the Mississippians inhabited but had not built. The Hopewell tradition was to the Mississippians something like what the Roman Empire is to modern Europeans: a presence in the landscape, a source of material that could be reused or reinterpreted, an impetus for stories about the past, but not a living tradition with continuous institutional structures. But the Mississippians knew the mounds were there. They used them. They built their own mounds near the old Hopewell earthworks in some cases, incorporating the older sites into their ceremonial landscape. They may have maintained oral traditions about who had built the old mounds, though none of those traditions survive in a form that can be identified with confidence. What they built on top of the Hopewell legacy was their own extraordinary chapter in the story of North American civilization, a chapter that climaxed around 1000 to 1200 CE, and that began to decline well before European contact, for reasons that are still debated, but that probably included climate change, agricultural exhaustion of the most productive areas, political instability, and the inherent difficulties of maintaining large urban populations in a pre-industrial economy. The decline of Cahokia, which was substantially complete by 1350 CE, is one of the most studied questions in North American archaeology and one of the least settled. The site was abandoned, or nearly abandoned, long before the Europeans arrived. The reasons for this abandonment are not clearly understood. Climate data suggests that the medieval warm period, which had been favorable for maize agriculture in the Illinois region, gave way to a cooler and more variable climate around 1200 CE that would have stressed the agricultural systems on which Cahokia's population depended. Political analysis of the site's internal structure suggests that the extreme hierarchical organization of Mississippian society, with its sharp distinctions between elites and commoners, and its demands on commoner labor for the construction and maintenance of the elite ceremonial landscape, may have generated internal tensions that eventually destabilized the political order. Ecological analysis of the region around Cahokia suggests that the combination of a large urban population and intensive agriculture had significantly degraded the landscape's carrying capacity by the site's peak, reducing the productivity of the surrounding farmland in ways that made the urban concentration increasingly difficult to sustain. All of these factors probably contributed. None of them alone is sufficient to explain the abandonment of a city that had been the largest in North America for several centuries. The full story of Cahokia's decline remains to be written, because the full story requires more archaeological work, more environmental analysis, and more careful attention to the historical dynamics of Mississippian political culture than has yet been brought to bear. What can be said is that by the time the first Europeans were moving through the region, Cahokia as a city was gone. The mounds remained and were observed by early French explorers who reached the area in the late 17th century, but the city they had once been the center of had been replaced by a dispersed pattern of smaller villages and towns. The organizational complexity that had produced Cahokia was still present in the Mississippian world, but expressed in smaller-scale forms more adapted to the changed conditions of the post-1200 period. And then the epidemics of the 16th and 17th centuries reduced even those smaller-scale societies to shadows of themselves, completing the transformation from a densely populated, complexly organized continent to the relatively sparse and dispersed population that European settlers encountered as they moved inland. That transformation is the key to understanding why the first explorers were so disturbed by what they found. They were encountering the physical evidence of a civilization that had been functionally destroyed before they arrived, not by them, in this case, but by the diseases that had preceded them. The mounds and earthworks they found were not the active ceremonial centers of a living civilization. They were the ruins, in some cases already ancient, of something that had peaked and declined, and then been catastrophically reduced by epidemic. The peoples who remained were not the civilization that had built these things. They were the survivors of that civilization's destruction, maintaining what they could of their traditions under conditions of extreme demographic and social stress. The explorers were looking at the aftermath of a catastrophe and seeing, in the monumental evidence of what had been here before the catastrophe, something that troubled them. Something that said, this was not simple. This was not primitive. This was something that deserves the word civilization, and the fact that it was in ruins, that it had been reduced to a fraction of its former scale, did not diminish the evidence of what it had been. If anything, it amplified the sense of mystery. Where had all this come from? What had happened to it? Who were these people and what had they achieved and where had it gone? Those are the questions that the first explorers were asking. The questions that the physical evidence of pre-Columbian North American civilization forced on anyone who looked at it honestly. And those questions have never been fully answered, not because the answers do not exist, but because the institutional and cultural frameworks within which American history has been told have consistently made it difficult to ask the questions in the way that would produce the most honest and complete answers. The answers are coming. They have been coming for decades, piece by piece. As archaeological methods have improved, and as the political context for honest reckoning with indigenous history has gradually, unevenly improved. The answers are in the genetic record, which continues to produce surprises about the origins and diversity of the founding populations of the Americas. They are in the environmental record, which preserves information about how intensively and skillfully pre-Columbian peoples managed their landscapes. They are in the earthworks themselves, which yield new information every time new dating methods or new survey technologies are applied to them. And they are in the oral traditions of the nations whose ancestors built these things, traditions that have survived everything that was done to destroy them and that carry, in their encoded forms, knowledge about the past that no other source preserves. The oral traditions are perhaps the most underutilized source in the study of pre-Columbian North American civilization, not because they are unknown. They have been collected and studied by anthropologists and folklorists for more than a century, but they have rarely been approached with the combination of respect for their historical content and rigor in their analysis that they deserve. They have often been treated as mythology, as stories that tell us about the beliefs and the cosmology of the peoples who tell them, but not about historical events. That treatment has occasionally been appropriate, but it has more often been a failure of interpretation. There are traditions in several Eastern North American nations that speak of the construction of the Great Mounds, that describe, in the encoded language of oral narrative, the social processes by which large communities were organized to build them, that preserve memories of the ceremonial purposes the mounds served and the astronomical knowledge that their construction required. Some of these traditions, when analyzed carefully and compared against the material evidence of the mounds themselves, show a level of correspondence that cannot be explained as coincidence. They are preserving real historical information, encoded in narrative form, about events that occurred hundreds or in some cases more than 1,000 years ago. That preservation is itself remarkable. It represents the capacity of human oral tradition, when maintained by communities with genuine commitment to the tradition's continuity, to transmit accurate information across very long time periods. The same capacity that has been demonstrated in Australian oral traditions that encode accurate information about coastal geography from before sea level rise more than 10,000 years ago. The same capacity that has been demonstrated in Scandinavian oral traditions that appear to preserve memories of specific volcanic events from the early medieval period. Oral tradition, properly maintained and properly analyzed, is a historical source of genuine value. The oral traditions of the mound-building cultures of Eastern North America deserve to be treated as such. They deserve it in the first instance because it is a matter of intellectual honesty. If the material evidence of the mounds corresponds to the narrative content of certain oral traditions, then both the material evidence and the oral tradition are doing the same work, preserving information about what happened, treating one as history and the other as myth, when they tell the same story, is not a principled methodological distinction. It is a form of selective skepticism that serves purposes other than the pursuit of knowledge. And they deserve it in the second instance, because the peoples who maintain these traditions deserve to have their knowledge recognized and respected on its own terms. The knowledge was not lost in the epidemic catastrophe. It was reduced and strained and partially fragmented, but it was maintained through everything that was done to discourage and destroy it, by peoples who understood that the knowledge was worth maintaining. That understanding was correct. The knowledge has value. It deserves the institutional recognition and the methodological engagement that would allow it to contribute fully to the ongoing project of understanding what North America was before 1492. That project is ongoing. It is producing new findings at a rate that would have been impossible even 20 years ago. LiDAR surveys of forested areas in the eastern United States have begun to reveal the extent of pre-Columbian landscape modification in regions where previous ground-level survey had been unable to penetrate the vegetation. The results are consistent with what is beginning to be accepted about the Amazon basin, that the apparent wilderness of the eastern North American forests is, in significant part, a managed landscape, a long-cultivated and long-organized environment whose human history has been obscured by the vegetation that grew over it after the epidemic catastrophe removed the people who maintained it. The extent of the modification is striking. Forest composition in areas that have been studied carefully consistently shows a human fingerprint. The distributions of tree species, particularly nut-bearing trees like chestnut and hickory and black walnut, reflect management practices rather than random ecological development. The soil in areas that were intensively cultivated in the pre-Columbian period is often visibly different from surrounding soils, darker and richer in organic material, the result of generations of agricultural amendment. The waterways that were managed by pre-Columbian peoples, dammed and redirected and maintained to support agriculture, show hydrological patterns that cannot be fully explained by natural processes alone. The continent was not a wilderness. It was a garden on a continental scale, maintained by a civilization that had been developing its agricultural and ecological knowledge for thousands of years and that had developed, by the time of European contact, a relationship with the land that was, in many respects, more productive and more sustainable than what replaced it. That is the context for the first explorers' unease. They were not just seeing the ruins of past greatness. They were moving through a managed landscape that retained, even after the epidemic catastrophe had removed most of the people who managed it, the marks of its management. The extraordinary productivity of the soils that astonished European settlers as they moved into the interior. The forest compositions that seemed almost too conveniently rich in edible and useful species. The waterways that behaved in ways that supported human habitation more reliably than random natural systems would. All of this was the residue of pre-Columbian civilization, the garden that had been left behind when the gardeners died. The explorers did not always understand what they were looking at, but they were honest enough, many of them, to record the strangeness of it, the productivity that seemed too great to be natural, the landscape that seemed designed, the evidence of organization and intention and long human occupation everywhere they looked. And beneath all of that, in the valleys and on the plains and along the rivers, the mounds. The great silent mounds, overgrown now with forest in many cases, their original shapes blurred by decades and centuries of growth, but still recognizably artificial. Still clearly the work of human hands and human minds and human intention on a scale that demanded explanation. The explanation that was finally provided, not the mound builder myth but the actual historical truth, is that North America was home to civilizations as complex and as sophisticated as those of the Old World, developing along different lines and producing different material cultures but representing equivalent levels of social organization and cultural achievement. that those civilizations left the earthwork complexes of Hopewell and the platform mound cities of Mississippian civilization and the vast trading networks that connected them across the continent, that those civilizations were destroyed largely by epidemic disease introduced by European contact before they could fully enter the historical record in their own terms, and that what the first explorers encountered and found so disturbing was the evidence of that destruction, the ruins of something great, still visible in the landscape, no longer fully explicable by the reduced populations who had survived the catastrophe. That is the true story that the mounds tell, not the story of a mysterious lost race vanished before the ancestors of the current indigenous peoples arrived, but the story of a civilization built by the ancestors of people who are still here, still carrying the traditions, still maintaining the knowledge, still telling the stories. A civilization that was not lost but broken, not vanished but reduced, not mysterious but simply unacknowledged by a national narrative that needed it to be otherwise. The acknowledgement is happening, slowly, imperfectly, but happening. The UNESCO World Heritage designation for Cahokia, the protection and interpretation of the Newark earthworks, the collaborative research programs between academic archaeologists and indigenous nations that are beginning to produce the more honest and more complete understanding that the evidence demands, the growing body of popular writing and documentary filmmaking that is beginning to tell the story of pre-Columbian North American civilization to audiences that were never taught it in school. The story is reaching people. It is reaching you, in this moment, wherever you are, and whatever time it is, and whatever state of waking or sleep you are in. The story of the mounds and the civilizations that built them. The story of the first explorers who encountered the evidence of those civilizations and found themselves disturbed by what they saw. The story of what was lost and how it was lost and what remains and what is still being recovered. It is a long story. It is a story that the earth itself has been keeping, in the shapes of its modified landscape and the chemistry of its managed soils and the geometry of its earthen monuments, for thousands of years. The earth has been patient. The mounds have been patient. The traditions that preserve the memory have been patient. The patience is paying off. Not completely, not yet, but the story is coming out. The mounds are still there, under the grass and the trees and the parking lots and the subdivisions and the cornfields and the shopping centers that have replaced so much of what was once a living ceremonial landscape. Still there, in the places where they survived. Still telling their story to anyone who looks carefully enough and asks the right questions and is willing to sit with the answer even when the answer is complicated. The first explorers who looked carefully enough were disturbed by what they saw. That disturbance was honest. It was the appropriate response to genuine evidence of something that their frameworks were not built to accommodate. We have better frameworks now. We have better tools. We have, slowly and imperfectly, a better willingness to look honestly at what was here before us, and what was lost, and what remains. Use that willingness tonight. Carry this story with you into whatever the dark hours bring. The mounds are standing in the American landscape right now, as they have stood for 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 years. The stars are moving above them, the same stars that their builders aligned them to. The earth is turning, as it has always turned, indifferent to the arguments about what was here and what happened to it and what it means. The meaning is in the mounds. The meaning is in the trade objects that cross the continent in the hands of people whose names we do not know. The meaning is in the astronomical alignments that required generations of patient observation to build. The meaning is in the oral traditions that survived when everything else was taken. The meaning is in the fact that we are still asking these questions, still finding these things worth knowing about, still capable of being disturbed by the evidence of what was here before we were. That capacity for disturbance is the appropriate response. It was appropriate for the first explorers. It is appropriate for us. The question of what was here and who built it, and what was lost when it was destroyed, is not a comfortable question. It was not comfortable for the people who first encountered the mounds and wrote about their unease. It should not be comfortable for us. But discomfort is not the same as despair. The story of pre-Columbian North American civilization is not only a story of loss, it is also a story of achievement and persistence and survival. The mounds are still there, the traditions are still alive, the knowledge is still being maintained and transmitted and built upon by the peoples who have never stopped living in this landscape, who have survived everything that was done to erase them, and who are still here to tell us something about what this continent was and what it can be. That is worth knowing. That is worth staying awake for, or worth drifting into sleep with, or worth carrying into whatever the next day brings. The first explorers were disturbed by what they found. We can be different. We can be grateful. Grateful for the evidence. Grateful for the persistence of the traditions. Grateful for the slowly improving willingness to look honestly at the full story. Grateful to be inheritors of a landscape that is, even now, more extraordinary and more ancient and more richly human than anything we were taught to expect. The mounds are there. The story is there. The night is long enough to hold all of it. Sleep well. The mounds are standing. The stars are turning. The questions are alive. And so, still, in ways that matter enormously, is the civilization that built them. Good night. There is a word that keeps appearing in the accounts of the early explorers, a word they used when they encountered the earthwork complexes of the Ohio and Mississippi valleys and the Gulf Coast. The word was ancient. Not old, not old-looking, ancient. A word they reserved for things that had been in place for a very long time, longer than recent history could account for, longer than any living memory could trace. They used it with the same weight that Europeans used the word when describing the ruins of Rome or the monuments of Egypt, with the implication that what they were looking at was the product of a civilization that had passed through its full arc of rise and fall and was now representable only by its most durable remains. They were right to use that word. Many of the earthwork complexes they were encountering were genuinely ancient, by any standard. Poverty Point, which some of them may have heard described by native informants even if they never saw it themselves, was nearly 3,000 years old. The oldest of the Hopewell earthworks in the Ohio Valley were 2,000 years old or more. Even Cahokia, which had declined only a few centuries before European contact, was ancient in the sense that it represented the culmination of a tradition going back much further than its own construction. The antiquity of what they were encountering was part of what disturbed them. European civilization had its ancient monuments, its Roman roads, and its medieval cathedrals, and its prehistoric stone circles. But those ancient things were understood within a narrative of European history that placed them in context, that explained them as products of known civilizations in a known sequence of development. The ancient things of North America had no such context available to the explorers who encountered them. They were ancient and unexplained, which is a combination that produces a particular quality of unease in the human mind. Not just the unease of the unknown, but the unease of the unknown that has been here longer than you thought possible. The Connecticut River Valley in New England produced some of the earliest encounters between arriving Europeans and the evidence of pre-Columbian civilization. The valley had been densely populated before epidemic disease struck in the 1610s and 1620s, and the settlements that the first English colonists found in the aftermath of those epidemics were not the functioning communities they would have been a generation earlier. But the evidence of what those communities had been was everywhere. The cleared and cultivated fields, the storage pits, the house sites, and in certain locations, the older things, the sites of ceremony and burial that predated the communities the epidemics had destroyed. Edward Winslow, one of the early Pilgrim leaders who maintained careful records of the Plymouth colony's interactions with the Wampanoag people, wrote descriptions of burial sites and ceremonial locations in the region that spoke of things he could not explain within his available frameworks. Objects of craftsmanship that did not match what the reduced, epidemic-devastated populations around him were capable of producing. Arrangements of stones and posts that suggested a sophistication of ceremonial practice that the current populations had no clear living tradition of maintaining. He did not know what to make of what he was seeing. He recorded it with the honest confusion of a man who was looking at evidence that told him the story was more complicated than the one he had been prepared for. Further south, in the Chesapeake region, John Smith's accounts of his explorations in the early 17th century contained similar moments of honest perplexity. Smith was an experienced traveler and a sharp observer and not given to easy amazement. But his descriptions of the Powhatan Confederacy and the landscape it inhabited include passages where the scale and the organization of what he was seeing clearly exceeded his expectations. The density of population in the tidal river valleys, the extent and sophistication of the agricultural systems, the evidence of long-established trade networks and political organization, these were not what his preconceptions about the New World had prepared him for, and his accounts, for all their cultural biases, carry the authentic marks of a man who was regularly surprised by the gap between what he had expected and what he found. The Chesapeake Tidewater was not a mound-building region. The evidence of pre-Columbian civilization there is expressed differently than in the Ohio Valley, but it is no less real. The extent of the cleared and cultivated landscape that Smith documented, the organization of the Powhatan Confederacy itself, which comprised dozens of individual chiefdoms united under a paramount chief in a political structure of considerable sophistication, the oral traditions that the Powhatan peoples maintained about their own history and about the history of the landscape before their current occupation. All of this was evidence of a civilization that had been developing its complexity for a very long time. The Powhatan oral traditions spoke of a time before the current era of the world, of peoples who had preceded the Powhatan in the landscape, of transformations in the land itself that belonged to a deep past. These traditions were not recorded in detail by the English settlers who heard them, partly because of language barriers, and partly because of a general disinclination to take indigenous oral traditions seriously as a historical source. What fragments were recorded suggest a historical consciousness extending back many generations, a memory of the landscape in different states than the one currently observed, a sense of deep human occupation of the land that was entirely consistent with the archaeological evidence that has since been developed. That archaeological evidence tells us that the Chesapeake Tidewater has been continuously occupied by human populations for at least 12,000 years. The same river valleys that John Smith described as the center of Powhatan civilization had been the center of human settlement in the region since the ice retreated. The agricultural systems the Powhatan were using when Smith arrived had been developing for more than 3,000 years. The political complexity of the Powhatan Confederacy was not something that had sprung up overnight or that was created by a single exceptional leader. It was the product of a long process of political development in a region that had supported dense human populations for thousands of years. Smith saw the end product of that process. He did not see the process. He had no access to the archaeological record that would later reveal the depth of the history he was moving through. But he was honest enough to recognize that what he was seeing was more than he had been prepared for. And his honesty, however imperfect, is one of the reasons his accounts remain valuable as historical sources, not just for what he directly reports, but for the texture of his surprise and confusion and occasional unease when the evidence exceeded his expectations. That texture is present throughout the early accounts of North American exploration, present in Champlain's descriptions of the Great Lakes region, present in the Jesuit relations, the annual reports filed by Jesuit missionaries in New France throughout the 17th century, which contain some of the most detailed and in many cases most honest accounts of indigenous civilization that survived from the early colonial period. Present in the accounts of the Dutch traders in the Hudson Valley, who found there a landscape and a set of peoples whose complexity, their commercial framework was not designed to fully register, but whose evidence survives in the specifics of what they traded and what they built and what they left behind. The Jesuit relations deserve particular attention because the men who wrote them were, in many cases, among the most careful and most intellectually serious observers of any who wrote about indigenous North America in the 17th century. They were not sentimentalists. They had come to the continent to convert its inhabitants to Christianity, and their accounts are shaped by that purpose in ways that cannot be ignored. But they were educated, observant, and in the best cases genuinely curious about what they were seeing, and their descriptions of the peoples and places they encountered are often more detailed and more honest than anything produced by the commercial explorers who preceded them. Father Jean de Brébeuf, who worked among the Wendat people in what is now southern Ontario in the 1630s, left accounts of Wendat society that document a level of political and social organization that was genuinely sophisticated. The Wendat Confederacy, sometimes called the Huron Confederacy by the French, was a political union of 4 and later 5 nations that managed its internal affairs through a formal system of councils and decision-making protocols that the Jesuits compared, not unfavorably, to the political institutions they knew from Europe. The agricultural system of the Wendat, which supported a population of perhaps 30,000 people in a relatively small territory, was so productive that the surplus it generated supported a substantial trade with surrounding peoples and allowed a level of social specialization unusual in what European observers expected of non-state societies. Brébeuf's descriptions of Wendat ceremony and cosmology are extraordinary documents. He wrote as someone who was trying to understand what he was seeing and to represent it accurately, even when it disturbed him, even when it conflicted with his own beliefs, even when it implied things about indigenous civilization that complicated the conversion project he was engaged in. He wrote about the scale and sophistication of the longhouses and the village fortifications. He wrote about the depth and complexity of the oral traditions he was able to access. He wrote about the evident antiquity of the social institutions he was observing, the sense that what he was seeing had been developing for a very long time and had reached a level of elaboration that implied centuries of continuous refinement. That sense of antiquity is one of the most consistent features of the early European accounts of indigenous North American civilization. The feeling that what they were encountering was not new, not improvised, not the product of recent adaptation to the specific conditions of the contact era, but something old, something that had been here, in one form or another, for a very long time. Something with deep roots in this landscape that the newcomers from across the ocean could sense even when they could not fully articulate what they were sensing. They were sensing, in the most general way, the truth. The peoples they were encountering were the heirs of civilizations going back thousands of years. The social institutions, the agricultural systems, the trade networks, the ceremonial traditions, the political structures, all of these represented the accumulated wisdom of many generations of life in specific places with specific resources and specific challenges. They were not primitive. They were not simple. They were complex in ways that were different from European complexity, built around different values and different technologies and different relationships between humans and the natural world, but not less sophisticated, and in many respects, more adapted to the specific conditions of North American life than anything the Europeans brought with them. The Europeans did not generally understand this. The colonial project required them not to understand it, or to understand it only in ways that could be made consistent with the justification of dispossession. But some of them saw more clearly than their cultural framework should have allowed. Some of them wrote things down that the official narrative was not equipped to accommodate. And those writings, preserved in archives and in printed collections of colonial documents, are the raw material from which a more honest history of what North America was before 1492 can be constructed. Constructing that history is the work of generations of scholars. It is not complete. It will not be complete for a very long time. The archaeological evidence continues to produce new findings. The genetic evidence continues to be refined. The oral traditions continue to be documented in ways that allow their historical content to be more carefully analyzed. And the political context within which this work happens continues to evolve, slowly and unevenly, in directions that make the honest accounting more possible than it was even a few decades ago. The accounting is not just for intellectual purposes. It is not just a matter of getting the facts right about the past, though that matters enormously. It is also a matter of recognizing what exists in the present. The peoples whose ancestors built Cahokia and the Hopewell earthworks and the great ceremonial centers of the Mississippi Valley are still here. They survived the epidemic catastrophe. They survived the colonial period. They survived the systematic destruction of their languages and traditions and family structures. They survived everything that was done to erase them from the landscape and from history. And they are here, now, maintaining what they maintained and building what they are building, in a present that is continuous with all the deep history that this telling has been moving through. That continuity is perhaps the most important thing to understand. The story of pre-Columbian North American civilization is not a story that ended in 1492 or 1600 or whenever the epidemic catastrophe reached any particular region. It is a story that continues. The peoples who are the inheritors of that civilization are still living in the landscape, still maintaining their relationships with the places their ancestors considered significant, still telling the stories that preserve the knowledge of what those places meant and what was done in them and what they still mean. The mounds are still in that landscape too, still standing where they were built, still aligned to the astronomical events their builders aligned them to, still carrying the marks of the human intention and the organizational achievement that produced them, still there, in Ohio and Illinois and Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana, in the places where they survived the plowing and the development, waiting to be understood. The first explorers who encountered them found them disturbing. That disturbance was honest and appropriate. It was the response of people who were seeing something that their framework could not contain. We have better frameworks now, but perhaps the disturbance is still the right response. Not the disturbance of incomprehension, but the disturbance of comprehension. The disturbance of understanding what these monuments represent and what was lost when the civilization that built them was destroyed, and how long the destruction has been papered over with myths and evasions and convenient simplifications. The disturbance of honesty is productive. It moves you toward the questions that need to be asked and the reckoning that needs to happen. It does not leave you comfortable with the incomplete version of the story. It insists on more. The mounds insist on more too. They have always insisted on more. They have been insisting on it since the first Europeans looked at them and felt the uncomfortable truth beginning to press against their preconceptions. They will keep insisting, for as long as they stand, which may be for a very long time. Listen to them. They are telling a story that begins long before any European set foot on this continent, a story that is still being told by the peoples whose ancestors built these monuments and whose traditions carry the memory of what was done here and why it mattered. That story is worth knowing. It is worth the long hours of attention it demands. It is worth the discomfort of the honest reckoning it requires. The mounds are there, the story is there, and you are here, at whatever hour it is, in whatever state of waking or sleep, which means you are part of the audience these monuments have always been waiting for. The people who built them to be seen and to be understood, and to outlast the immediate moment of their construction. They built them for the future. You are the future they built for. Sleep in that knowledge. Rest in the understanding that the story of this land is longer and richer and more human than anything you were taught in school. That the evidence of what was here before is still here, preserved in the landscape and in the traditions, and in the careful work of the people who have never stopped asking what it means. Good night. The mounds are standing. The stars are the same stars. And the story goes on. The copper of the Great Lakes is one of the most remarkable materials in the story of pre-Columbian North American civilization. Not because copper is unusual. Copper exists in many places in the world, and its working is one of the earliest metallurgical skills developed by human cultures everywhere that copper ore is accessible. But the copper of the Lake Superior Basin is unusual in a specific way that made it the foundation of a continental trade network and a ceremonial material of extraordinary significance for thousands of years. The unusual quality is that Lake Superior copper occurs in large deposits as native copper, meaning copper in its metallic form, already reduced from ore by natural geological processes, available to be worked without smelting. This is not how most copper in the world occurs. Most copper deposits are ores, minerals that must be heated to high temperatures to extract the metal. But in the Lake Superior Basin, including on the Keweenaw Peninsula of what is now Michigan, and on Isle Royale, and in certain areas along the north shore of the lake, copper occurs as native metal in pieces ranging from small nuggets to multi-ton masses. It can be hammered and shaped without any metallurgical processing beyond the application of heat and cold, alternately, to make it more workable. Human beings in the Lake Superior region were working this copper 9,000 years ago. The Old Copper Complex, as archaeologists call it, was producing copper tools and weapons and ornaments from approximately 4000 BCE and possibly earlier. In a North American context, this represents one of the oldest and most extensive metalworking traditions anywhere in the hemisphere. Copper spear points, copper knives, copper axes and adzes, copper fish hooks, copper needles. A copper material culture more diverse and more practically oriented in its earlier phases than the primarily ceremonial copper traditions that followed it. Over time, the use of copper in the Great Lakes region shifted from primarily practical to primarily ceremonial. This shift is interesting because it suggests something about the social trajectory of the communities involved. Copper tools were displaced by stone tools, which may sound like regression but actually reflects increasing efficiency in the use of lithic materials rather than the abandonment of metal technology. And copper itself became increasingly associated with prestige, with ceremony, with the expression of social rank and the marking of important individuals and events. The amount of copper that ends up in burial contexts in the Hopewell and Mississippian traditions, sometimes hundreds of kilograms at a single site, reflects the extraordinary value that pre-Columbian North American civilization placed on this material and the extraordinary organizational capacity required to move it from the Lake Superior Basin to burial sites 1,000 kilometers away. The mining operations at Lake Superior were not casual. Archaeological investigation of the ancient mine sites on the Keweenaw Peninsula and on Isle Royale has revealed evidence of systematic, large-scale mining operations dating back thousands of years. Hundreds of mining pits, millions of pounds of copper extracted, stone hammers by the thousands, the tools used to break the native copper free from the surrounding rock, found in deposits that represent millennia of accumulated use. The scale of the ancient copper mining in the Lake Superior region is comparable to industrial mining operations of the historic period. It required planning, it required coordination, it required the transportation of large quantities of material over long distances. It required, in short, exactly the kind of organizational capacity that the word civilization implies. Where did all the copper go? The Lake Superior copper was extracted over thousands of years. The total amount removed from the ancient mines is estimated, based on the volume of mine pits and associated debris, at hundreds of millions of pounds. But the total amount of copper that has been recovered in archaeological contexts across North America, including the extraordinary deposits in Hopewell and Mississippian burial mounds, is a tiny fraction of that total. Most of the copper that was extracted from the ancient Lake Superior mines has simply not been found. It was either recycled over and over again, which copper's physical properties permit, or it ended up in contexts that have not been archaeologically investigated, or it was converted into forms that have not been preserved. The missing copper is one of the great puzzles of North American archaeology. Where did it go? What was it used for? What percentage of what was mined ended up in the burial context where it is found? And what percentage went into the living economy as tools and objects of trade and markers of social status that were used and reused until they finally degraded or were remelted? The answer to these questions would tell us something important about the scale and the organization of the pre-Columbian economy of Eastern North America. But the answer is not currently available because the evidence needed to determine it has either not been found or is not findable. What is available is striking enough. The copper objects that do survive in museum collections from Hopewell and Mississippian contexts are some of the most remarkable artifacts of pre-Columbian North American civilization. Copper breastplates engraved with complex figurative imagery, copper headdress ornaments of extraordinary sophistication, copper ear spools and necklaces and hand symbols and axes, some of them clearly ritual objects with no practical function, made to the highest possible standard of craftsmanship in a material that required considerable skill to work. These objects did not appear suddenly. They are the products of a tradition of copper working that stretches back thousands of years and that represents an unbroken line of artistic and technical development. The artistic tradition visible in Hopewell and Mississippian copperwork connects to a broader system of symbolic expression that encompasses copper, stone, shell, mica, and other media, and that represents one of the most distinctive and sophisticated artistic traditions in pre-Columbian North America. The imagery in this tradition, the bilobed arrow shapes, the hand and eye motifs, the raptor figures, the falcon warrior images, the weeping eye symbols, forms a coherent iconographic system that appears in recognizable variations across the entire geographic range of the Mississippian world and in antecedent forms in the Hopewell tradition. This iconographic system, which archaeologists call the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex or sometimes the Southern Cult, is evidence of something important. It is evidence that the peoples of the Mississippian world shared not just trade goods, but ideas. That there was a common cultural and religious framework that connected communities from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes, that was expressed in consistent symbolic terms across enormous geographic distances, and that was maintained over several centuries. This is not the cultural landscape of isolated, disconnected bands. This is the cultural landscape of a civilization with shared values and shared symbolic systems and shared ceremonial practices, maintained across a trading network that gave physical form to the ideological connections. The exploration of what that shared symbolic system meant, what the iconography represented and what the ceremonies involved and what the worldview underlying all of it was, is one of the most active areas of research in North American archaeology. The progress has been significant in recent decades, particularly as indigenous knowledge holders have engaged more actively with researchers to share oral and ceremonial knowledge that illuminates the imagery. The falcon warrior figure, for instance, which appears in copper and shell across the Mississippian world, has been connected by some indigenous scholars to ceremonial traditions that persist in attenuated forms in some Eastern nations today. The hand and eye motif has been interpreted in light of oral traditions about the underworld and the relationship between the living and the dead. The weeping eye symbol has been connected to ceremonies of mourning and renewal. These connections are not certain. They require careful evaluation against the evidence and honest acknowledgement of the gaps between what can be demonstrated and what remains speculative. But they represent something new in the study of pre-Columbian North American civilization. They represent a genuine dialogue between the material evidence and the living knowledge traditions, a dialogue that was not possible when the academic study of archaeology and the living indigenous communities were more rigidly separated and more mutually suspicious. That dialogue is producing insights that neither source of knowledge could generate alone, and it is producing them in a way that respects both the integrity of the archaeological method and the authority of the indigenous knowledge that informs and illuminates the material record. The De Soto expedition of 1539 to 1543 encountered this ceremonial world at what was probably close to its last full flowering. By the time De Soto's army moved through the American Southeast, Cahokia had been abandoned for more than a century. But the tradition that had produced Cahokia was still alive in the region, expressed in dozens of smaller but still impressive centers. The great mound centers of Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi and Tennessee and Arkansas were still functioning ceremonial and political capitals when De Soto arrived. The chiefs who ruled from their platform mounds were still commanding the kind of respect, still maintaining the kind of authority that the Mississippian political system had developed over centuries. De Soto was not a gentleman, and his expedition was not a gentle expedition. It was a military operation in search of gold, willing to use violence to extract information and resources, moving through a populated landscape with the assumption that what it found could be taken. The accounts of the expedition that survive, written by several members who kept records and published later, describe violence alongside the wonder, the capture of chiefs to use as hostages, the forced labor of indigenous people to carry the expedition's supplies, the burning of towns that resisted, the destruction of food stores that were the product of years of agricultural labor. But the accounts also describe, because the observers were honest enough not to omit what they saw even when it complicated the military narrative, the extraordinary things the expedition encountered. the Etowah site in Georgia, which the expedition called Itaba, with its large platform mounds and surrounding palisade, the site in Alabama that may have been Moundville, described as a major town with a chief of great authority. The great mound centers of the Mississippi Valley, described in terms that made clear the observers understood they were moving through the heart of a major civilization. The population densities that the accounts document, when you do the archaeological and historical demographic work to evaluate them, to suggest that the southeast was more densely populated in 1540 than it would be again until the 18th century. The epidemic catastrophe that followed de Soto's expedition struck with particular ferocity in the southeast. The populations concentrated in the large agricultural towns and ceremonial centers, which were exactly the populations that suffered most from the introduced diseases, were reduced by enormous percentages in the decades following contact. The political structures that depended on those populations collapsed. The ceremonial centers that had been maintained by large organized communities could no longer be staffed and were abandoned. The long-distance trade networks that had sustained the Mississippian world lost the populations needed to maintain them. What survived was remarkable in its own right. The peoples who endured the catastrophe, who rebuilt their communities in the ruins of what had been, who maintained their traditions under the conditions of epidemic loss and colonial pressure that followed, were demonstrating a resilience that is itself one of the most impressive achievements of North American indigenous civilization. The cultures of the historic period, the Muskogee and the Cherokee and the Choctaw and the Chickasaw and the many other nations of the Southeast, are the direct inheritors of the Mississippian tradition. They carried forward what they could. They transformed what they had to. They survived what was done to them, and they maintained the knowledge, the ceremonial traditions that connected to the old iconographic system, the oral traditions that preserved the memory of the great centers, the agricultural knowledge and the ecological knowledge and the political knowledge that had been developed over thousands of years of life in the southeastern landscape. They maintained it through everything, through the epidemic catastrophe, through colonial pressure, through the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears, through the boarding school era and the termination policies of the 20th century. Through all of it, the knowledge is still there, reduced from what it was, transformed by the conditions under which it has had to survive. But there, still in the hands and the minds and the ceremonies of people who have never stopped being who they are, regardless of what the governments and the churches and the schools tried to make them into. That persistence is the other side of the story that the mounds tell. The mounds tell the story of what was built. The persistence of the traditions tells the story of what survived. Both are necessary for a complete understanding of what North America was and what it has become. The survival of indigenous knowledge traditions is not separate from the story of the mounds and the civilizations that built them. It is the continuation of that story. It is the evidence that the civilization whose physical monuments are the mounds was not destroyed completely, that something essential was preserved, however transformed by the conditions of survival, and passed forward through the generations to the present. That the people who are the inheritors of Cahokia and the Hopewell earthworks and the southeastern ceremonial complex are not just the archaeologists who study them. They are the living communities who have never stopped being connected to that tradition, even when the connection was forced underground or transformed by crisis. Honoring that connection requires more than archaeological curiosity. It requires the political and institutional recognition that the descendants of the mound builders have a primary relationship to this heritage. That the study of pre-Columbian North American civilization is not just a matter for academic specialists, but is a matter of justice and of honest reckoning with what was here and what was done to it. That the living knowledge traditions are not supplementary to the material record, but are equal partners in the ongoing effort to understand the full human story of this continent. Those recognitions are slowly, unevenly being made in the collaborative research programs that are developing, in the legal and policy frameworks that are giving indigenous nations more authority over their cultural heritage, in the growing body of scholarship that takes indigenous oral traditions seriously as historical evidence, in the conversations that are beginning to happen between academic archaeologists and indigenous knowledge keepers on terms of greater equality and mutual respect. The conversations are happening, the understanding is growing, the story is becoming more complete, not quickly enough, not without friction, but moving in the right direction. The direction matters, because the story of what was here before is not a story that is finished. It is a story that is still being told by the peoples whose ancestors created it, and by the researchers who are trying to recover it, and by the evidence that the landscape itself preserves. It is a story that includes this moment, this telling, this particular thread of attention being paid to a question that has been waiting too long for adequate attention. Pay it now. Bring whatever attention you have left in this particular hour to the story of what was here, to the mounds standing in their valleys and on their plains, to the copper traded across a continent for thousands of years, to the astronomical alignments still pointing at the moments in the sky that someone found worth marking, to the iconographic system still legible in the objects that survived, still connected to the living traditions that illuminate it. Pay attention to the survival, to the peoples who are here still, who carried all of this forward through everything, who are here now, in this world, living the continuation of the story that began long before any European explorer set foot on this continent. That is the whole of the story, finally. Not a mystery solved, but a mystery more fully understood. Not a civilization lost, but a civilization transformed and reduced and partly recovered, and still in the process of the recovery that the peoples involved are leading on their own terms. The first explorers were disturbed by what they found. They were right to be disturbed. The disturbance was the appropriate response to evidence that exceeded their frameworks. We have better frameworks now, but the evidence still exceeds them. We are still in the position of finding out, year by year and discovery by discovery, that what was here was greater and more complex and more ancient than we had been prepared to acknowledge. That ongoing expansion of understanding is one of the most exciting things happening in the study of human history right now. Not in the old world, where the broad outlines of civilization's development have been known for a long time, but in the Americas, where the full story is still being assembled, where the evidence is still producing surprises, where the gap between the official story and the full story is still being closed. The closing is happening. You are part of the audience for the closing, and that is worth something, wherever you are and whatever time it is. Sleep now. The mounds are there, the traditions are there, the story is still going, and you are here for it. Good night. The question of the Adena culture is one that formal archaeology has not yet settled to its own satisfaction, and that unsettlement is itself revealing. The Adena were the people who preceded the Hopewell tradition in the Ohio Valley, who flourished roughly from 1000 BCE to 200 CE, and whose burial mound tradition is the direct precursor of the elaborate Hopewell mortuary complex. They are, in the conventional archaeological narrative, a fairly straightforward culture, a middle-level complex society in the eastern woodlands, characterized by burial mound construction, a degree of social hierarchy, and early participation in the continental trade networks that the Hopewell tradition would later develop to a much greater scale. But the Adena are also associated, in the popular history of North American archaeology, with something that formal archaeology has treated with considerable skepticism, the Grave Creek Stone. In 1838, during excavations of a large Adena burial mound at Grave Creek, West Virginia, a small sandstone tablet was found. It was inscribed with what appeared to be a series of symbols, not pictographs, not the kinds of marks that were expected in a North American archaeological context, something that looked, to several observers, like letters, like writing. The Grave Creek Stone generated enormous controversy from the moment of its discovery. Dozens of scholars attempted to decipher the inscription, with results ranging from convincingly argued translations into Phoenician, or Iberian, or Libyan, to demonstrations that the marks were meaningless, or that the stone itself was a forgery. The debate was never fully resolved, and the stone disappeared from institutional collections at some point in the late 19th century, which removed the possibility of modern analysis and ensured that the controversy would remain unsettled. The significance of the Grave Creek Stone is not that it proves contact between pre-Columbian North America and the Old World, or that it represents a writing system, or any other specific conclusion. The significance is in what it reveals about the state of the question. From the moment of its discovery, the question of whether there was more to the story of pre-Columbian North American civilization than the conventional narrative acknowledged was alive and actively debated. And the way that debate was conducted, with the mainstream academic community's determination to dismiss any evidence that challenged the established narrative, and the informal community's determination to find in every ambiguous piece of evidence the confirmation of far-reaching alternative theories, established a dynamic that has persisted in North American archaeological debate ever since. The dynamic is not healthy. It produces, on the mainstream side, a reflexive dismissal of anomalous evidence that sometimes extends to evidence that deserves more careful attention than dismissal. And on the alternative side, it produces an eagerness to interpret ambiguous evidence as confirmation of specific theories that the evidence does not actually support. Both responses are distortions of what honest inquiry requires. Honest inquiry requires following the evidence wherever it leads, holding conclusions proportionate to the evidence, and maintaining the capacity to be surprised by what turns out to be true even when it does not fit any pre-existing theory. The Hopewell Trade Network is an example of evidence that has been sufficiently well documented that it cannot be dismissed, but whose full implications have still not been fully integrated into the standard account of pre-Columbian North American civilization. The network's continental extent is documented. The objects that traveled through it are in museum collections. The dates of the network's operation are established by radiocarbon dating. What remains to be fully integrated is what the network means for our understanding of the social complexity of the peoples who maintained it. Maintaining a continental trade network requires much more than just the willingness to exchange objects. It requires the infrastructure of trade, regular routes with reliable passage, systems for establishing and maintaining trust between trading partners who may never meet in person, mechanisms for setting values and ensuring fair exchange across cultural boundaries, languages of communication that can bridge the gaps between different linguistic communities, and the security infrastructure to protect the traders and the goods they carry through territories that are not their own. All of this was present in the Hopewell Trade Network. It was not improvised. It was the product of generations of development, building on earlier trading traditions that stretched back well before the Hopewell era. The waterways of eastern North America, particularly the Ohio and Mississippi systems and their tributaries, provided the infrastructure of movement that made continental trade possible. The peoples who controlled access to key points on those waterways had structural advantages that translated into political and economic power. The great Hopewell centers in the Ohio Valley were not located there by accident. They were located at confluences and portages and other key points in the continental water transportation network, at the places where the movement of goods necessarily concentrated. The political economy of the Hopewell world, organized around the control of key points in the trade network and the redistribution of prestige goods from those control points to surrounding populations, is recognizable as a form of political organization that appears in complex societies in many parts of the world. It is not identical to the political economies of Bronze Age Mesopotamia or classical Mediterranean or medieval Europe. It is a different expression of similar structural logic, and recognizing it as such, rather than treating it as something sui generis and therefore incomparable to anything in the broader human record, is part of what a fully honest account of pre-Columbian North American civilization requires. The people who built the Hopewell earthworks were the beneficiaries of this political economy. They were also, in some ways, its expression. The great ceremonial sites of the Hopewell tradition are the physical embodiment of the organizational capacity that the trade network required and generated. They are the places where the products of the network were ceremonially deposited, where the social relationships that sustained the network were ritually reaffirmed, where the cosmological framework that gave meaning to the whole enterprise was physically instantiated in earthen geometry and astronomical alignment. Standing at the Great Circle earthwork at Newark, Ohio, which is the only portion of the original Newark complex that has been protected in its entirety, You can feel something of what standing in those places must have meant to the people who built and used them. The enclosure is large, about 1,200 feet in diameter, and the walls rise to perhaps 10 or 15 feet at their highest. The interior is a wide, grassy area that, in its original form, would have been a carefully maintained ceremonial precinct. It is not an obviously dramatic place, in the way that the mesas of the southwest or the fjords of Norway are dramatic, but it has a quality of enclosure and intentionality that is very clearly the product of human design rather than natural accident. That quality of intentionality is one of the most consistent features of the great earthwork sites of eastern North America. They were built to produce specific experiences for the people who moved through them. The parallel walls that connect the circle and the octagon at the High Bank Works in Chillicothe were not just engineering features. They were the channels through which the movement of ceremony was directed, the physical expression of a choreography of ritual that transformed the landscape into a setting for human action aimed at something beyond the ordinary. Moving through those parallel walls toward the astronomical alignments of the octagon was not like walking down a road. It was like entering a different register of experience, a space of heightened significance, where the normal rules of ordinary life were suspended and replaced by the rules of ceremony. That is what the great earthwork sites were for. They were the infrastructure of the sacred, in the specific sense that they were the places where the sacred was enacted, where the community's relationship with the cosmos was physically performed. And performing that relationship, maintaining it, rebuilding it when the cycles of the year required it, was not a peripheral activity for the Hopewell world. It was central. It was the activity around which everything else was organized. The trade network existed partly to supply the materials for ceremony. The political hierarchy existed partly to organize the labor of earthwork construction and maintenance. The astronomical knowledge existed to determine the times and orientations of the ceremonies. The whole complex social and material world of the Hopewell tradition was in some fundamental sense oriented toward the sacred sites and the activities that took place within them. This is not a primitive relationship with the world. This is a sophisticated one. It is a relationship that takes seriously the question of what human life is for and what role the community plays in maintaining the cosmic order that makes human life possible. It is a relationship that invests enormous resources in the answer to that question, and it is a relationship that the earthwork complexes, in their surviving form, allow us to feel the presence of even 2,000 years after the people who created them are gone. The feeling is important, not because it tells us specifically what the people who built these sites believed or what they did in them, but because it confirms that they were people who felt deeply and built accordingly, who took the questions that matter most, the questions about what the cosmos is and where humans fit in it, and what obligations the living have to the dead and to the unborn, with the utmost seriousness, and expressed that seriousness in the most durable form available to them. That expression is still present in the landscape. The great circle is still there. The High Bank octagon is still there. Monk's Mound is still there. Watson Brake and Poverty Point and the ancient copper mines of the Keweenaw are still there. The objects in the museum collections are still there. The oral traditions of the nations whose ancestors created all of this are still there, maintained by communities that have never stopped being who they are. All of it is still there, waiting for the attention it deserves, waiting for the honest reckoning that the full story requires, waiting, with the patience of things that have already waited a very long time, for the moment when the gap between the official account and the full truth is closed enough that what was here can finally be understood in the full depth of what it was. That moment is coming. It has been coming for a long time, and it is closer now than it has ever been. The archaeology is better. The genetics are better. The dialogue between academic research and living indigenous knowledge is better. The political will to be honest about what happened and what it cost is better. However inadequate it remains. Something is shifting. Slowly, but shifting. And the direction of the shift is toward the truth that the mounds have been standing in for 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 years. The truth that something extraordinary was here. That people built with intelligence and ambition and deep knowledge of the sky and the land. that what they built was destroyed, not by the mysterious forces of cosmic inevitability, but by specific historical processes that can be named and understood, and that what survived the destruction is still here, still available, still worthy of the understanding it has not yet fully received. The first explorers were disturbed by the first glimpse of that truth. The disturbance is still appropriate. It should disturb us, that we have told ourselves a simplified story for so long, that we have let the mounds stand in their fields and forests without telling the full story of what they mean, that we have let the descendants of the people who built them carry the weight of that unacknowledged history for 5 centuries. The disturbance should move us toward the honest accounting, toward the research programs and the collaborative frameworks and the political recognitions that the situation requires, toward the willingness to let the story be as complicated and as rich and as human as it actually is. The mounds are there. They have always been there, patient and heavy and precisely built, saying the same thing they have always been saying to anyone with the attention to hear it. We were here. We built this. We found this landscape worth marking and worth understanding and worth the full investment of our knowledge and our skill. We were human here, fully and deeply and with all the ambition and the care that being human implies. And the evidence of our humanity is in the ground, where we put it, where it has been waiting for you to look. Look, that is all the mounds ask. That is all the story requires. Look, and let what you see disturb you appropriately, and then let the disturbance become the beginning of understanding. That is enough for tonight. That is more than enough. The rest is in the landscape, waiting for the people who will go and look and ask the right questions in the places where the answers are kept. Sleep now. The mounds are there. The story is there. The people who carry it are there. And you, having listened, are part of the carrying. Good night. The Pacific coast is where the story of pre-Columbian North American civilization takes a turn that the standard narrative is particularly poorly equipped to handle. Not because the Pacific Coast peoples are less well known than the mound builders of the East. In fact, some of the cultures of the Northwest Coast, the Haida and the Tlingit and the Tsimshian and the Kwakwaka'wakw and their neighbors, are among the most visually distinctive and most widely recognized of any indigenous North American tradition. The totem poles, the potlatch ceremony, the split face masks and the formline art tradition. These are images that have entered a degree of popular awareness that many of the mound-building traditions have not. But the popular awareness of Northwest Coast art and ceremony is largely aesthetic and ethnographic. It is an awareness of surface rather than of depth, of the distinctive visual tradition rather than of the civilizational achievement underlying it. And the civilizational achievement underlying the Northwest Coast cultures is genuinely extraordinary, representing one of the most remarkable demonstrations in human history that complexity and prosperity and rich cultural expression are not exclusively products of agriculture. The Northwest Coast peoples were not primarily agricultural societies. They were societies built on the extraordinary productivity of the marine and riverine environments of the Pacific Coast, particularly the annual salmon runs that filled the rivers of the region with more protein per cubic meter than almost any agricultural system could produce per unit area. The salmon were the foundation of everything. They were the resource that made it possible to maintain large, sedentary populations without agriculture. That supported the accumulation of surplus, that funded the potlatch and the commissioned art and the elaborate ceremonial life of the Northwest Coast. That enabled the development of a degree of social complexity that is, by most measures, comparable to the complexity of agricultural civilizations of similar population size. The potlatch is the institution that most clearly expresses the civilizational character of Northwest Coast society. It is a ceremony of redistribution, in which a host demonstrates wealth and status not by accumulating possessions but by giving them away. The largest potlatches involve the distribution of enormous quantities of goods to invited guests, the literal public performance of generosity as the highest social virtue. The political economy of the Northwest Coast was organized around the competition to give rather than the competition to accumulate, and this inverted relationship to wealth and status produced a social system that was in some respects more stable and more equitable than systems organized around accumulation. The potlatch was made illegal by the Canadian government in 1885, and the prohibition was not repealed until 1951. That 66-year prohibition was the most direct expression of the colonial state's recognition that the potlatch was not just a ceremony but the engine of a social system that was incompatible with the values and institutions of the settler society, a society that organized itself around generosity and redistribution rather than accumulation, was a society that could not be straightforwardly integrated into a capitalist economy. The ceremony had to be suppressed, and the social system it supported had to be disrupted before the people who practiced it could be brought within the economic and social order that the colonial state was trying to impose. The suppression did not work. The ceremony went underground. It was practiced secretly for decades, and when the prohibition was finally lifted, the potlatch re-emerged, diminished by the years of suppression but not destroyed. It is practiced today in the communities that have always been its home, in forms that reflect both the continuity of the tradition and the transformation it underwent during the decades when it had to survive in hiding. The survival of the potlatch is a microcosm of the larger story of indigenous cultural survival in North America. The colonial state consistently misidentified the most important elements of indigenous culture as the things it could most easily attack. It targeted the ceremony, the language, the family structure, the spiritual practice, because these were the visible expressions of the culture's distinctiveness. What it did not fully understand was that the deeper elements of the culture, the values and the knowledge and the relationships that the ceremonies expressed and the languages carried and the families transmitted, were harder to attack precisely because they were not contained in any single institution or practice. They were distributed across the whole web of relationships that constituted the community. When one thread of that web was cut, the others bore the weight. The potlatch bore the weight through 66 years of illegality, and the knowledge of the land and the sea that underlay the material prosperity the potlatch redistributed bore its own weight through the same period and longer. The fishing knowledge, the navigation knowledge, the ecological knowledge of the coastal and riverine systems that made Northwest Coast civilization possible was maintained through every disruption because it was necessary for survival. You cannot survive without knowing where the salmon run and when and how to catch them. The knowledge was not just culture, it was life. The depth of that knowledge is one of the most striking features of Northwest Coast civilization when examined carefully. The peoples of the Pacific coast had developed, over thousands of years of intensive use of the marine and riverine environment, an understanding of ecological systems that in many respects exceeds what Western science developed about those same systems until the late 20th century. The management of salmon populations through careful harvesting practices and habitat protection, the knowledge of tidal and current patterns that made navigation in the complex coastal waters possible and reliable, the understanding of the relationships between different species in the coastal ecosystem that informed sustainable harvesting practices. All of this represented a body of knowledge that was sophisticated, empirically grounded, and maintained across generations through systematic transmission in exactly the way that scientific knowledge is maintained. The first Europeans who encountered the Northwest Coast in the late 18th century, when Spanish and British expeditions began making systematic contact with the region, were encountering a civilization that had been developing this knowledge for thousands of years. They were encountering people who were, in their own domain, as knowledgeable and as technologically capable as any culture on Earth. The ocean-going canoes of the Haida and the Tlingit, built without metal tools from enormous cedars using techniques refined over centuries, could carry dozens of people in conditions that would challenge modern small craft. The navigation systems that allowed these peoples to move reliably across the complex waters of the Inside Passage and beyond were as sophisticated as anything available to the European explorers who encountered them. The European explorers recognized this. The accounts of the Vancouver expedition, which conducted a systematic survey of the Northwest Coast in the early 1790s, contain repeated acknowledgments of the sophistication of the peoples they were meeting, the organization of the villages, The quality of the craftsmanship in the carved and painted objects, the evident prosperity of the populations and the complexity of the trade networks connecting communities along the coast. These were not the descriptions of a simple or primitive people. They were the descriptions of a people who had built, over a very long time, in a very specific environment, something that deserved the word civilization. But the Pacific Coast story goes back much further than the cultures the European explorers encountered in the 18th century. The coastal peoples of the Pacific Northwest have been in continuous occupation of the same coastline for at least 14,000 years. The oldest, well-documented sites on the northwest coast date to the earliest period after the glacial ice retreated, and the evidence from those earlier sites suggests that the people who were there then were already skilled maritime peoples with a sophisticated relationship to the coastal environment. The Kelp Highway hypothesis that some researchers have proposed, the idea that the first Americans may have moved down the Pacific coast of North America following the productive ecosystems of the kelp beds, has gained increasing support from both genetic and archaeological evidence. The coastal route into the Americas, as an alternative to the ice-free corridor through the interior, is now taken seriously by most researchers in the field. And if the coastal route was real, then the Pacific Coast peoples are the descendants of the first Americans, the most ancient lineage in the hemisphere. The implications of this for the story of Pacific Coast civilization are significant. If the coastal peoples have been in place for 14,000 years, then the extraordinary knowledge of the coastal environment that characterizes Northwest Coast civilization is not the product of a few hundred or even a few thousand years of adaptation. It is the product of a 14,000-year relationship between a people and a place. A relationship of that depth is qualitatively different from anything that can develop in a shorter period. It is not just knowledge, it is intimacy, a knowing of the coast that is part of the bones and the blood as much as the mind, that is encoded in cultural practice and spiritual relationship as much as in explicit cognitive knowledge. The oral traditions of the Northwest Coast peoples reflect this depth. The stories are old, not just in the sense that they have been told for many generations, but in the sense that they carry within them information about the landscape that can be dated by reference to specific geological and climatic events. Stories about great floods that transformed the coastline, stories about volcanic events that changed the landscape, stories about the behavior of glaciers and the behavior of salmon in conditions different from those of the present. Stories that, when examined by geologists and ecologists, turn out to contain accurate information about events that occurred thousands of years ago. This is the kind of oral tradition that has been encountered in other cultural contexts, most famously in Australia, where Aboriginal oral traditions have been demonstrated to preserve accurate information about coastal geography from before sea level rise more than 10,000 years ago. The Northwest Coast traditions do the same thing. They are not just cultural memory, they are a form of empirical record, maintained across thousands of years, encoding accurate information about the physical environment in the narrative forms that oral tradition uses to transmit knowledge. The value of that record is enormous, and the work of understanding it, of developing the methods for reading oral tradition as an empirical historical source, while respecting its cultural integrity and the authority of the communities that maintain it, is one of the most interesting frontiers in current North American research. Not frontier in the colonial sense. Frontier in the sense of an edge of knowledge beyond which more understanding lies, accessible through careful and respectful inquiry, conducted in genuine partnership with the people who hold the knowledge. That inquiry is happening, not as fast or as broadly as it should be, but it is happening in the collaborative research programs and the indigenous-led documentation initiatives and the growing body of scholarship that takes oral tradition seriously as a historical source. And it is producing insights that no amount of archaeological excavation or genetic analysis alone could produce, because it is accessing a form of knowledge that only survived because living people maintained it. Living people. That is the point that deserves to be made one more time, as clearly as possible. The story of pre-Columbian North American civilization is not a story about the past. It is not a story about people who are gone. It is a story about people who are here, about civilizations that were damaged but not destroyed, about traditions that were suppressed but not eliminated, about knowledge that was attacked but not erased. The people who are the inheritors of Cahokia and the Hopewell earthworks, and the copper mines of Lake Superior and the potlatch ceremony, and the great oral traditions of the northwest coast, are living people in the present world. They are dealing with the consequences of what was done to their ancestors. They are rebuilding what was damaged. They are asserting their rights to the heritage that was taken from them or marginalized in the national story. They are doing this work in a political and social environment that is better than it was 50 years ago, but still far from adequate to the scale of what was done and what is owed. Acknowledging what was here before the first explorers arrived is not just a matter of historical accuracy, it is a matter of justice. It is part of the ongoing process of reckoning with the colonial history of the continent and with the extraordinary cultures and civilizations that colonial history displaced and damaged and attempted to erase. That reckoning is not complete. It is not even close to complete, but it is underway in ways that were not possible even a generation ago. The first explorers were disturbed by what they found because it exceeded their frameworks for understanding what the New World was supposed to be. We have better frameworks now. We have the archaeological and genetic and environmental evidence that they did not have. We have the political and institutional evolution, however incomplete, that has made it possible to at least begin the honest accounting. We have the living voices of the communities whose ancestors created the civilization the explorers found so disturbing. Voices that were not silenced even by everything that was done to silence them. We have all of this, and we are still, in some ways, in the position of the first explorers, still finding that the full story is larger than we had been prepared for, still discovering that what was here was greater and more complex and more deeply human than the simplified story allowed, still being disturbed in the appropriate way by the gap between what we knew and what the evidence keeps telling us. That gap is closing. It will keep closing. And when it is finally, fully, honestly closed, what will be visible is not a mystery but a history, not a lost civilization but a transformed one, not a story that ended in catastrophe but a story that bent around catastrophe and is still, remarkably, continuing. The story of what was here before the first explorers arrived is the story that is still being lived by the peoples whose ancestors created it. It is the story that the mounds are still telling, that the copper objects in the museum cases are still telling, that the oral traditions are still telling, that the landscape itself is still telling to anyone who knows how to read it. You know a little more of how to read it now than you did when this began. That is something. That is more than something. Carry it with you, into sleep, into tomorrow, into whatever the next thing is. The story is worth carrying. It always was. Good night. The Southwest is where the architectural ambition of pre-Columbian North American civilization finds its most visually dramatic expression. Not in earthen mounds, though the Southwest has those too. Not in the managed forests and agricultural fields of the East, though the Southwest has its own extraordinary agricultural systems, but in stone, in the multi-story stone structures that rise from the canyon floors and cling to the canyon walls of what is now New Mexico and Arizona and Colorado and Utah, and that have been, for more than a century, the most widely recognized symbols of pre-Columbian North American civilization in the popular imagination. Chaco Canyon in northwestern New Mexico is the center of the southwestern story in the same way that Cahokia is the center of the Mississippian story. At its peak, from approximately 850 to 1150 CE, Chaco was the hub of a regional system that encompassed hundreds of communities connected by a network of roads stretching across hundreds of miles of high desert plateau. The great houses of Chaco, the multi-story stone masonry structures that archaeologists call pueblos, were the largest buildings in North America north of Mexico until the 19th century. Pueblo Bonito, the largest of the Chacoan great houses, contained more than 600 rooms arranged in a 4-story D-shaped structure around a central plaza. It was built with a masonry technique that modern architects and engineers have studied for its structural sophistication and its precise use of materials. The Chaco road system is one of the most remarkable pieces of infrastructure in pre-Columbian North America. The roads are straight, impressively, almost improbably straight, in the way that only Roman roads in the Old World are straight, running for dozens of miles across the plateau with a consistency of bearing that implies knowledge of surveying technique that the conventional understanding of pre-Columbian North American technology does not easily accommodate. The roads were engineered. They were cut through bedrock in some places and raised above the ground surface in others. They were 30 feet wide, wider than they needed to be for foot traffic, suggesting a ceremonial function as much as a practical one. And they converge on Chaco Canyon from multiple directions, turning the canyon into the nexus of a planned regional system in a way that clearly reflects deliberate design rather than organic development. The first Euro-American investigators who examined Chaco in the 19th century were as disturbed by what they found as any of the earlier explorers encountering the mounds of the East. The Lieutenant James Simpson, who visited Chaco in 1849 as part of a military survey of the region, wrote an account that expressed both wonder and confusion. The scale of the ruins, the quality of the masonry, the extent of the road system, these exceeded what his expectations of pre-Columbian North American civilization had prepared him for. He was seeing, he wrote, evidence of a civilization that was in some respects more advanced than what history had attributed to the peoples of this part of the continent. He was right. Chaco represents a level of civilizational achievement that the conventional narrative of pre-Columbian North America, with its emphasis on simple, mobile, resource-following bands, fundamentally cannot accommodate without significant revision. The organization required to build the great houses, to engineer the road system, to maintain the regional network of communities that exchanged goods and people and ideas across hundreds of miles, was not simple. It was sophisticated. It implied institutional structures and knowledge traditions and long-term planning horizons that are the marks of civilization in any part of the world. The astronomical knowledge embedded in Chacoan architecture is one of the features that most clearly marks the civilization's sophistication. Chacoan great houses are oriented with significant relationships to solar and lunar events. Pueblo Bonito's main facade faces south, and the structure's internal alignments produce a series of light and shadow effects at solstices and equinoxes that must have been designed into the building's plan from the beginning. The solar marker of Fajada Butte, where a dagger of sunlight passes through a spiral petroglyph at the summer solstice, is one of the most elegant astronomical devices in the archaeological record of any culture. The Great Kiva at Casa Rinconada is aligned so that a shaft of sunlight enters through a window on the northeast wall and illuminates a niche on the opposite wall at sunrise on the summer solstice. These are not coincidental alignments. They are the product of deliberate design based on careful astronomical observation. The people who built Chaco knew the sky. They had been watching it for generations, accumulating the knowledge needed to translate astronomical observations into architectural alignments. And they built that knowledge into the most permanent structures they could create, because they understood that the relationship between their buildings and the sky was not incidental to the purpose of those buildings, but central to it. The ritual and cosmological significance of astronomical events in Chacoan culture is documented not just in the architectural alignments, but in the objects found in Chacoan contexts and in the oral traditions of the Pueblo peoples who are the descendants of the Chacoans. The astronomical knowledge of the historic Pueblo peoples is extensive and highly developed, reflecting a continuous tradition of sky-watching and celestial ceremony that has never been interrupted, however much it has been forced underground or transformed by colonial pressure. The Hopi and the Zuni and the various Kerasan-speaking Pueblo peoples all maintain ceremonial calendars organized around solar and lunar observations, ceremonial practices that require precise knowledge of the sky, and oral traditions that explain the relationship between celestial events and the life of the community. Those ceremonial traditions connect directly to what the archaeological record of Chaco documents. Not as a simple linear descent. The archaeology of those connections is more complex, but as part of a continuous cultural tradition that has maintained the core relationships between the sky and the human community for well over 1,000 years. When Pueblo knowledge keepers talk about what Chaco was and why it mattered, they are speaking from within a tradition that never lost its connection to the place. However long the formal occupation of the canyon had been over before any of them were born, the abandonment of Chaco, which happened in the 12th century CE for reasons that are still debated, is one of the most studied questions in southwestern archaeology. The best current interpretation draws on multiple lines of evidence. Dendrochronology, the dating of wood based on tree ring patterns, shows that the century from approximately 1090 to 1190 CE was marked by severe and prolonged drought in the San Juan Basin, the region centered on Chaco Canyon. The agricultural system that supported the Chacoan regional network depended on rainfall that was chronically marginal even in good years. Several generations of drought would have been devastating to agricultural productivity and therefore to the population that depended on it. But drought alone does not explain the specifics of Chaco's abandonment. Archaeological evidence suggests social stress, as well as environmental stress. The distribution of resources in the Chacoan system shows increasing inequality in the last decades before abandonment, with the elites concentrated in the canyon accumulating a disproportionate share of goods, while outlying communities received less. This kind of increasing inequality is a pattern that appears in other complex societies under stress, where the institutions designed to manage collective action become increasingly extractive as they struggle to maintain their position in the face of declining resources. The populations that were most exploited by the Chacoan system may have been the first to leave, and their departure would have reduced the labor and the tribute that the great house construction and maintenance required, accelerating the system's decline. What happened to the people of the Chacoan world when they left the canyon is becoming clearer through archaeological and genetic research. They moved. Some moved north, into the region of Mesa Verde in what is now southwestern Colorado, where the great cliff dwellings that are now one of the iconic images of the American Southwest were built by a population that included significant numbers of Chacoan migrants. Others moved east, toward the Rio Grande Valley, where the historic Pueblo communities are concentrated today. Others moved south, into areas of Arizona that eventually became the homeland of the Hopi. The abandonment of Chaco was not a disappearance. It was a dispersal, a reorganization of a regional population in response to changed circumstances, a transformation rather than an extinction. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde are a remarkable chapter in the post-Chacoan story. They were built in the late 13th century, in the decades just before the final abandonment of the Colorado Plateau region, in a period that was both climatically challenging and apparently socially tense. The cliff locations, accessible only by ladders and hand and toe holds cut into the rock, were not chosen for convenience. They were chosen for defensibility. The population of the Mesa Verde region was building its homes in locations that were as difficult to attack as possible, which suggests a period of social instability and conflict. What the conflict was about, who was fighting whom, what resources or territory or social position were at stake, is not fully clear from the archaeological evidence. But the cliff dwellings themselves, with their carefully planned layouts and their sophisticated storage systems, and their beautiful painted pottery and their elaborate ceremonial spaces, tell us that whatever pressures the people of Mesa Verde were under, they maintained the full complexity of their cultural tradition through it. They were not fleeing in disarray. They were reorganizing deliberately, choosing new locations for their communities with care, continuing to build and make art and perform ceremony, even in the face of whatever challenges they were facing. That combination of stress and cultural persistence is one of the most consistent features of the Southwestern story. The people who built these extraordinary places did not build them in easy times. They built them in response to the full range of pressures that complex human societies face: climatic variability, resource competition, social inequality, political instability. The monuments they left behind are not just evidence of achievement. They are evidence of resilience. of the capacity to maintain cultural identity and cultural production under conditions that would reduce many societies to subsistence. The Anasazi, as the prehistoric peoples of the Colorado Plateau are sometimes called, are a name that some of the communities descended from them have asked researchers to stop using because it is a Navajo word that translates approximately as ancient enemies or ancient ones who are not us, and does not reflect how the Pueblo peoples understand their relationship to their ancestors. The descendants of the Chacoan and Mesa Verde peoples prefer to speak of their ancestors in terms that reflect the continuity between the ancient builders and the living communities, rather than the distance and difference that the Anasazi framing implies. This is not a trivial point. It goes to the heart of how the story of pre-Columbian North American civilization is told, and who has the authority to tell it. The living Pueblo peoples have a primary authority over the interpretation of the sites their ancestors built. This is not because their oral traditions are always more accurate than the archaeological record, or because their interpretation of any specific site should automatically override the findings of archaeological analysis. It is because the tradition of knowledge they maintain, the cultural framework within which the sites were built and used and understood, is an essential resource for understanding those sites that no amount of archaeological excavation can fully substitute for. The two sources of knowledge, the material record and the living tradition, need each other. Neither is complete without the other. The work of bringing them together, of developing research frameworks in which indigenous knowledge and archaeological science are genuinely equal partners, rather than one being subordinate to the other, is the work that the most thoughtful researchers in the field have been engaged in for the past several decades. It is producing better interpretations of the sites, better understanding of what the artifacts meant and what the buildings were for and what the ceremonial practices were aimed at. Better appreciation of the full complexity and the full humanity of the civilization that built these extraordinary places. That better understanding is available to anyone who seeks it. The museums that hold the collections from Chacoan excavations, the national parks that preserve the Great House ruins and the cliff dwellings, the publications of the researchers who are doing the collaborative work, the statements and the scholarship of the Pueblo knowledge keepers who are contributing their knowledge to the broader conversation about what their ancestors built and why it mattered. The knowledge is there, the story is available. What remains is the willingness to engage with it seriously, to let it be as complicated and as rich as it actually is, to resist the simplifications that the official story has offered for so long, and to hold instead the fuller truth that the evidence demands. The fuller truth is more interesting, more human, more worthy of the attention it asks for. The civilization that built Chaco Canyon and the Hopewell earthworks and Cahokia and the copper trading network and the extraordinary cultures of the Northwest Coast was not simple or primitive or savage. It was sophisticated and organized and deeply knowledgeable about the world it inhabited. It was diverse, expressing its complexity in different ways in different regions with different environments, but connected across those differences by trade and ceremony and shared symbolic systems and the long human capacity for reaching across distance to maintain relationships. It was, in the fullest sense of the word, civilization, and the first explorers who encountered its remnants and found themselves disturbed were responding to that fact in the only way that honesty allowed, with the discomfort of people who were seeing something that their frameworks could not contain and that their purposes could not easily accommodate. We can accommodate it now. We can let the story be what it is. We can carry the full complexity of what North America was before 1492 alongside the story of what happened after, and let the juxtaposition produce whatever reckoning it produces. The reckoning is worth having, the story is worth knowing, and the people who carry it forward, in the living communities that are the inheritors of all of this, are worth listening to. Listen. The mounds and the great houses and the earthwork enclosures and the copper objects in their museum cases have been saying something for a very long time. The living traditions have been saying the same thing in a different register. We were here. We built this. We knew this land. We looked up at this sky. We were human in this place, fully and deeply, long before any explorer set foot on this shore. That is the disturbance the first explorers felt. That is the disturbance we should feel. And that is the beginning of the honest reckoning that the story demands. Good night. The sites are standing. The traditions are alive. The story is there. All of it, waiting. The Great Plains are not where most people expect to find evidence of pre-Columbian civilization. The image of the plains in popular culture is the image of the post-horse era, after the Spanish reintroduction of horses to the Americas in the 16th century, and the subsequent development of the horse-mounted bison hunting cultures of the Lakota and the Comanche and the Blackfoot and their neighbors. That image, powerful and vivid as it is, captures only the last 3 or 4 centuries of a human story in the plains that goes back at least 12,000 years, and that at various points included levels of social complexity and territorial organization that the popular image completely obscures. The medicine wheels of the northern plains are one of the features of that longer story that the popular image erases. The term medicine wheel refers to a category of stone construction found primarily on high ridges and elevated terrain across the northern Great Plains and extending into the foothills of the Rockies, that consists of a central cairn with radiating lines of stones forming a wheel-like pattern. They vary considerably in size and elaboration. Some are small and relatively simple. Others are large and complex, with multiple rings and multiple spokes and central features of considerable size. And several of the most complex ones have been found to have astronomical alignments similar to those documented at the earthwork enclosures of the east and at the great house complexes of the southwest. The Bighorn Medicine Wheel in Wyoming is the most studied of these structures. It sits at an elevation of about 9,000 feet on a ridge in the Bighorn Mountains, accessible in summer but buried under snow for much of the year. It is approximately 25 meters in diameter, with 28 spokes radiating from a central cairn. Astronomical analysis has found alignments at the wheel to the summer solstice sunrise and to the heliacal rises of 3 bright stars, Aldebaran, Rigel, and Sirius, at the time of year when the wheel is accessible. The heliacal rise of a star is the date when it first becomes visible in the dawn sky after a period of invisibility, and the heliacal rises of the 3 stars aligned at Bighorn are spaced approximately a lunar month apart, suggesting that the wheel may have functioned as a calendrical device that allowed observers to track the progression of the summer season in a landscape where the arrival of snow made timing critical. The Majorville Medicine Wheel in Alberta is older than Bighorn and possibly much older. The central cairn of the Majorville Wheel has been excavated, and the deepest deposits in it have been radiocarbon dated to approximately 5,000 years ago. If the central cairn was built 5,000 years ago, the wheel is one of the oldest constructed astronomical devices in North America and among the oldest in the world, comparable in age to some of the earliest phases of Stonehenge. This does not mean that the current configuration of the wheel is 5,000 years old. The wheel has clearly been added to over many centuries, with new spokes and new rings being added by successive generations of people who used the site. But the site itself, in its core, is genuinely ancient. The peoples who used the medicine wheels, and who continue to use some of them for ceremonial purposes, are primarily the First Nations of the Northern Plains and the Rocky Mountain foothills. The Blackfoot Confederacy has cultural affiliations with many of the medicine wheel sites in Alberta and Montana. The Stoney Nakoda and the Cree and the Crow and other nations have their own relationships with specific sites. The oral traditions associated with the medicine wheel speak of purposes that include ceremony and vision quest and the marking of important events in the community's relationship with the sky. They also speak, in some cases, of origins that predate the current occupants of the landscape, of sites that were already old when their own ancestors arrived. This pattern of indigenous oral traditions acknowledging that certain sites predate the current occupation of the territory, that something was already there, is one that appears across the continent in relation to the oldest and most enigmatic sites. It is not a pattern that suggests the current indigenous peoples are disclaiming connection to the sites. Rather, It is a pattern that reflects an honest acknowledgement of the complexity of the human history of the landscape. People have been moving through these territories for a very long time. Earlier peoples left marks. Later peoples found those marks, incorporated them into their own relationships with the landscape, added to them, maintained them. The result is often a site that represents multiple layers of human activity across a very long time period, each layer adding to rather than replacing what came before. The medicine wheels of the northern plains represent this kind of palimpsest. Multiple generations of people, over thousands of years, coming to the same elevated locations, finding them meaningful, adding to the stone constructions already there, using the sites for purposes that may have changed over time even as the basic relationship with the sky that the sites express remained continuous. The astronomical alignments of the oldest layers and the astronomical alignments of the more recent additions may reflect different specific purposes or different specific ceremonies, but they reflect the same fundamental practice, the use of stone construction to mark the relationship between the human community and the turning of the celestial sphere. That relationship between the human community and the sky is one of the most consistent threads in the entire story of pre-Columbian North American civilization. From the astronomical alignments of the Hopewell earthworks in Ohio to the solstice markers of Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, to the medicine wheels of the northern plains, to the solar calendars of the southwest pueblos, the cultures of pre-Columbian North America expressed, in their most permanent and most carefully crafted constructions, a relationship with the sky that was not decorative or incidental but central. The sky told them where they were in time. The sky organized the year and the seasons and the planting and the harvesting and the ceremonial life that gave the community its meaning and its cohesion. The sky was the fundamental reference point for everything else. Building that reference point into stone, aligning the most permanent human constructions to the movements of the sun and moon and stars, was the expression of how seriously these civilizations took the relationship between human life and the celestial order. It was also the expression of a confidence that the relationship would persist, that the alignments would still be meaningful in the future, that whatever came after would find the same sky above them and would therefore find the stone markers useful and significant. That confidence was well placed. The sky has not changed in any important way since these structures were built. The solstice sun rises today in exactly the direction it rose when the Hopewell earthwork enclosures were being planned. The stars align today as they aligned over Chaco Canyon in 1100 CE. The stones still point where they were pointing. The relationship they express is still available to anyone who knows where to look. The plains were also the setting for the bison economy that underlies the history of the region in a way that the popular image of the horse-mounted hunter only partially captures. The bison herds that once covered the plains numbered in the tens of millions and represented one of the largest concentrations of terrestrial animal biomass on Earth. Managing access to that resource, harvesting it sustainably over many generations, required a level of ecological knowledge and a degree of social organization that the conventional image of nomadic plains hunters does not reflect. The buffalo jump, the technique of driving bison over cliffs by coordinated human action, is one of the most studied features of pre-Columbian plains subsistence. The logistics of a successful buffalo jump required the coordination of dozens or hundreds of people in roles ranging from the drivers who channeled the herd toward the cliff to the processors who handled the enormous quantity of meat and hide and bone that a successful drive produced. The organization required was not improvised. Buffalo jumps were used repeatedly over many generations, and the detailed knowledge of bison behavior and terrain that made them successful was accumulated over exactly that kind of long experience and transmitted through exactly the kind of institutional knowledge preservation that characterizes complex societies everywhere. Head smashed in Buffalo Jump in Alberta, a UNESCO World Heritage Site that takes its name from a Blackfoot tradition about a young man who was found buried in bison carcasses at its base, has been in use for approximately 6,000 years. 6,000 years of the same technique, using the same topography, refined by each generation's experience and transmitted to the next. The archaeological deposits at the base of the cliff, where the carcasses accumulated over 6 millennia, are meters deep and contain the bones of millions of bison. The organization required to run a successful jump at Head Smashed In was not simple. It required leaders who knew the technique and could coordinate the participants. It required a clear understanding of wind direction and bison behavior and the specific topography of the drive lanes. It required, in short, a tradition of knowledge and a tradition of leadership that had been maintained for 6,000 years. That tradition is one of the things that survived the disruption of the plains bison economy in the 19th century, when the deliberate commercial slaughter of the bison herds destroyed the ecological and economic foundation of the plains nations in a campaign that was explicitly understood by its perpetrators as a way of making indigenous resistance to displacement impossible. You cannot maintain a civilization based on the bison economy if there are no bison. The slaughter was not incidental to the project of conquest. It was a central tool of it. The bison were nearly extinct by the 1880s. The knowledge traditions that the Plains nations had built over 6,000 years of sophisticated ecological management of the bison herds were not extinguished with the bison. They survived in the memories of the elders and in the oral traditions and in the ceremonial life that continued even under the conditions of reservation, confinement, and cultural suppression that followed the conquest. And when conservation efforts began to rebuild the bison herds in the 20th century, the Plains nations were among the most active advocates for that rebuilding because they understood the relationship between the bison and the land and the human communities of the Plains in ways that the conservation establishment was only beginning to learn. The bison are coming back, not to the numbers they once reached, not to the extent of their historic range, but the herds are growing, and the Plains nations are at the forefront of the efforts to restore them, and to restore the grassland ecosystems that the bison and the Plains peoples managed together for thousands of years. This is not nostalgia. It is the application of 6,000-year-old ecological knowledge to a contemporary conservation challenge. It is the inheritance of pre-Columbian civilization being brought to bear on a problem created by the processes that destroyed that civilization. That is the kind of continuity that makes the story of pre-Columbian North American civilization not just a story about the past, but a story about the present and the future. The knowledge that the ancient builders and the ancient farmers and the ancient hunters and the ancient astronomers developed in their long relationships with the specific environments of this continent is not dead knowledge. It is potentially useful knowledge. Knowledge about how to live in a specific place over the long term, developed through exactly the kind of long experience and careful transmission that produces reliable understanding. Western science is increasingly recognizing this. The field of traditional ecological knowledge, the systematic study of what indigenous peoples know about the ecosystems they have inhabited over long periods, has developed into a recognized discipline that is being applied in conservation, in restoration ecology, in climate adaptation planning. The knowledge of the Plains peoples about the bison, the knowledge of the Pacific Coast peoples about the salmon runs, the knowledge of the Pueblo peoples about water management in arid environments, the knowledge of the Eastern Forest peoples about the management of the forest for a combination of wild food resources and cultivated crops. All of this is being taken seriously, slowly and unevenly, but genuinely, as knowledge that has things to teach about how to maintain productive and sustainable relationships with the ecosystems that all of us depend on. The first explorers found the evidence of this knowledge disturbing because it exceeded their expectations. The knowledge exists. It was developed over thousands of years by civilizations that the standard story of North American history has consistently underrepresented and undervalued. And it is still here, in the hands of the peoples who maintained it through everything that was done to destroy it. The story of what was here before the first explorers arrived is the story of how that knowledge was developed and what it produced. Of the civilizations that rose and flourished and transformed and declined and whose descendants are here today, still carrying the tradition, still building on what their ancestors created. That story is worth knowing. It is worth carrying forward, and it is worth telling, clearly and honestly, and with the full respect that the civilizations involved deserve. The first explorers were disturbed by what they found. The disturbance was appropriate. It was the response of honest observers to evidence that exceeded their frameworks. We have better frameworks now, but we are still finding, year by year, that what was here was greater than we had been prepared to acknowledge, that the gap between the official story and the full story is still being closed. The closing is what we are in the middle of. It is what this telling has been a small part of. And it is what the mounds and the earthworks and the great houses and the medicine wheels and the oral traditions and the living communities are all contributing to, each in their own way, each with their own irreplaceable piece of the full picture. The picture is coming together, slowly, but it is coming. Sleep in that knowledge. Rest in the understanding that the story of this land is richer and older and more human than anything the official version has offered. That the evidence is there, for anyone willing to look, that the people who carry the tradition are here, doing the work of the recovery that the situation demands, and that you, having listened, are a small part of the audience that the builders of the mounds and the road systems and the astronomical alignments were building for. They built for the future. You are the future they built for. Good night. The story is still going. It will keep going for a very long time, and that, in itself, is everything. The genetics of the first Americans is the frontier where the story of pre-Columbian North American civilization is being most actively rewritten right now. Not the material culture, however remarkable it is. Not the earthwork architecture, however impressive it remains. But the molecular record preserved in ancient DNA, the genetic signatures carried in the bones of people who lived 10,000 or 15,000 or 20,000 years ago, that is telling us things about who the first Americans were and where they came from, that are upending the models that have governed the field for decades. The basic model, the one that held sway for most of the 20th century, was the Clovis first hypothesis. According to this model, the first people to reach the Americas crossed the Bering Land Bridge from northeastern Siberia to Alaska at some point between 13 and 15,000 years ago, when the last ice age had lowered sea levels enough to expose a wide land bridge connecting the two continents. These people then moved south through a corridor that opened between the retreating Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets, and within a relatively short time they were distributed across both North and South America. They are represented archaeologically by the Clovis culture, named for the site in New Mexico, where their distinctive fluted projectile points were first discovered and studied. The Clovis first hypothesis was elegant. It was supported by a body of evidence that, at the time it became the consensus, was genuinely compelling, and it was consistent with the broader narrative of American prehistory that the institutions of the discipline had developed over decades. For most of the 20th century, it was the model against which any alternative had to prove itself. The model is now broken, not revised, not modified at the margins. Broken by evidence from multiple directions that collectively makes the Clovis first hypothesis untenable as a complete account of the peopling of the Americas. The pre-Clovis sites, particularly Monteverde in Chile with its 14,500-year date, which was rigorously established and is now universally accepted, have made it impossible to maintain that Clovis was first. People were in southern South America before the Clovis corridor opened. They must have gotten there by a different route and at a different time. The genetic evidence makes the situation even more complex. Ancient DNA analysis of pre-Columbian remains from across the Americas has revealed a pattern of founding populations that does not fit a single crossing at a single time by a single ancestral group. There are at least two distinct founding populations detectable in the ancient genetic record, and possibly more. There are genetic signatures in some ancient South American remains that point toward ancestry in populations with connections to Australia and Southeast Asia, not to the northeastern Siberian populations that the Beringia crossing model posits as the source. There are signatures in some North American ancient genomes that point toward ancient Eurasian populations, specifically the ancient North Eurasian lineage represented by the Malta child burial from Siberia, dated to 24,000 years ago. What this means is that the peopling of the Americas was not a single event. It was a process, extended over time, involving multiple source populations, possibly using multiple routes, producing a diversity of founding populations across the continent that subsequent millennia of mixing and migration have partially obscured. The ancestors of the people the first European explorers encountered were not a homogeneous group descended from a single bearing crossing. They were the descendants of a complicated human story that we are only beginning to be able to read through the molecules preserved in ancient bone. That complicated story is also the story of the civilizations this telling has been moving through. The Hopewell builders and the Mississippians and the Chacoans and the Plains peoples and the Northwest Coast nations, all of them were the heirs of this deep and diverse genetic history. The specific cultural traditions they developed, so different from each other in their material expression but connected through trade and ceremony and shared symbolic systems, were the product not just of their specific environments, but of the full complexity of the founding populations from which they descended. Understanding that complexity changes how we understand the civilizations themselves. It makes them less mysterious, in the sense that the diversity of approaches to civilization that they represent becomes more comprehensible once you understand the diversity of the founding populations. But it also makes them more remarkable, in the sense that the achievement of civilizational complexity across such a diverse genetic and cultural substrate is itself extraordinary. The genetic story is still being written. New ancient DNA analyses are published regularly, each one adding something to the picture and occasionally revising what had seemed to be settled. The technology is improving rapidly. The ethical frameworks for doing this research in ways that respect the rights and the concerns of the living communities descended from the ancient remains are developing, slowly and imperfectly, but developing. And the results are consistently pointing in the same direction, toward a pre-Columbian North American past that is more ancient, more diverse, and more connected to the broader human world than any model developed before the genetic era could have predicted. The connections are perhaps the most surprising element. The genetic evidence of connections between early Americans and populations in Australia and Southeast Asia was not predicted by any model based on archaeological evidence alone. It emerged from the data, and it demands an explanation that the conventional framework is not equipped to provide. The explanation that most researchers consider most plausible involves maritime routes, the movement of people along coastal pathways that are now mostly submerged under the ocean that rose as the ice melted, and that therefore left very little accessible archaeological evidence. The Kelp Highway route down the Pacific coast of North America is part of this story. But the connections to populations with Australasian affinities suggest that the maritime dispersal was not just a North Pacific phenomenon. It may have involved movement across the Pacific or around the southern rim of the ocean in directions that the conventional model of human dispersal has not previously allowed. These are big ideas. They require evidence more substantial than currently exists to be fully established. The researchers who are working on them are appropriately cautious in how they state their conclusions, but the evidence that is currently available is sufficient to establish that something happened in the peopling of the Americas that the conventional model cannot account for, and that whatever it was, it left genetic signatures in the ancient population of the continent that connect to populations in parts of the world that the Beringia crossing model provides no pathway from. The first explorers who encountered the evidence of pre-Columbian North American civilization and found themselves disturbed were responding to the material legacy of these ancient founding populations and the civilizations their descendants built. They did not know any of this. They did not have the genetic tools or the radiocarbon dating or the comparative archaeological record that we have now. They had only what they saw in front of them, the earthworks and the ruins and the populations reduced by epidemic disease, and the traces of what had been in the landscape. And what they saw disturbed them. The disturbance was appropriate. The evidence was telling them that the story was more complicated than they had been prepared for. The evidence is still telling us that. Every new genetic analysis, every new archaeological excavation, Every new LiDAR survey that reveals pre-Columbian landscape modification in areas previously thought to be untouched wilderness adds to the evidence that what was here before the first explorers arrived was extraordinary. The full accounting of that extraordinary history is still being constructed. It will not be complete in any of our lifetimes. The evidence is too distributed, the methods are still developing, the collaborative frameworks needed to do the research honestly are still being built. But the direction is clear. The picture is getting richer. The story is getting longer and more complex and more human. And at the center of that story, in every telling of it, are the people who built the mounds and the great houses and the road systems and the ceremonial complexes and the trade networks. People who were fully human in the full sense of that word, with all the ambition and the knowledge and the care and the organizational capacity and the relationship with the sky that being human implies. People whose descendants are still here, carrying the tradition, doing the work of the recovery, telling their own part of the story in their own ways and on their own terms. Those people deserve to have their story told honestly. They deserve to have the civilizations their ancestors built recognized for what they were. They deserve to have the destruction of those civilizations acknowledged as what it was. And they deserve to have their knowledge, the knowledge that survived everything, recognized as what it is, a resource of extraordinary value for understanding both the past and the present. The first explorers found what they found disturbing. The honest response to that disturbance would have been to change the frameworks that made it impossible to understand what they were seeing. Some of them tried. Their accounts, however imperfect, preserve the honest confusion of people who were confronted with evidence they were not equipped to interpret. Those accounts are the beginning of the reckoning that is still, 5 centuries later, not fully complete. We are further along the road to honest reckoning than the first explorers were. We have better tools, better frameworks, better political contexts for the work of understanding. But the reckoning is not done. The gap between the official story and the full truth is still being closed. And the closing is what this telling has been a part of. Carry it forward. However you carry things, in whatever form works for you. In curiosity or in advocacy or in the simple willingness to see the story as it is rather than as the simplified version offers it. In respect for the people who are here now, doing the work of the recovery. In attention to what the evidence says, and in the patience to let the story be as complicated and as rich as it actually is. The first explorers were disturbed by what they found. The disturbance was the beginning of a reckoning that is still underway. The reckoning is the work of everyone who is willing to do it, including, in your own small way, whoever you are, wherever you are, at whatever time it is where you are. The mounds are standing, the traditions are alive, the story is going, and you are part of it. Sleep well, the story will still be here in the morning. It has been here for a very long time. It will be here for a very long time more. Good night. There is one more thread to follow before the night finally closes around this story. It is the thread of what the landscape itself remembers. Not the constructed landscape, the mounds and the earthworks and the great houses and the road systems, but the natural landscape. The forest and the soil and the waterways and the ecology of the continent. Because the landscape is not passive in the story of pre-Columbian North American civilization. It is not simply the stage on which human events played out, it is one of the actors. It was shaped by human activity over thousands of years in ways that are still visible to researchers who know how to read its signals. The forests of eastern North America are not natural. That statement sounds strange. The forests are obviously there, obviously composed of native species, obviously organized according to ecological principles that have nothing to do with human planning. But the composition of those forests, the relative abundance of different species, the distribution of different tree types across the landscape, reflects thousands of years of human management as much as it reflects the autonomous operation of ecological processes. The chestnut was once the most abundant tree in the eastern deciduous forest. Not the most abundant native tree, the most abundant tree, period. Billions of chestnut trees covered the Appalachians and the surrounding lowlands, from Maine to Georgia, from the Atlantic coast to the Ohio Valley. The chestnut was the dominant species in a forest that had been partly shaped by human management of the chestnut for a very long time. Indigenous peoples throughout the eastern woodlands used chestnut as a primary food source. They actively managed the forest to favor chestnut trees, reducing competition and promoting the growth of productive individuals in ways that increased the availability of the nut crop. The extraordinary abundance of chestnut in the historic eastern forest was partly the product of thousands of years of indigenous management. The American chestnut blight, introduced from Asia in the early 20th century, killed virtually every mature chestnut tree in North America within a few decades. 4 billion trees were killed by a fungal pathogen in one of the largest ecological disasters in recorded history. The forest that now occupies the range of the historic chestnut forest is a different forest, reorganized around the species that filled the gap the chestnut's death created. It is a natural forest in the sense that it is composed of native species operating according to natural processes, but it is also an artifact of the disruption of the human-chestnut relationship that had been operating for thousands of years before the blight arrived. The soil of the eastern woodlands is another form of landscape memory. In areas that were intensively farmed in the pre-Columbian period, particularly in the river valleys where the large agricultural communities were concentrated, the soil shows the marks of human management. It is darker and richer in organic material than surrounding soils. It holds water differently. It supports different plant communities. This anthropic soil modified by long human occupation and management, is found across the eastern United States wherever there was intensive pre-Columbian agriculture. It is a physical record of the agricultural civilization that occupied those valleys for centuries. It is a form of civilizational legacy written in the earth. The waterways of the continent are also forms of landscape memory. The great rivers of eastern North America, the Mississippi and the Ohio and the Tennessee and the Illinois and their tributaries, are rivers that were intensively managed by pre-Columbian peoples for at least several thousand years. The management included the construction of fish weirs and dam complexes that manipulated water flow for agricultural and subsistence purposes. It included the clearing of land along the river banks that changed the hydrology of the watershed, and it included, in some areas, the construction of canal systems that allowed the movement of water and boats in ways that nature alone did not permit. The remnants of some of these management systems are still visible in the landscape, as archaeological features or as persistent differences in land use and vegetation patterns that reflect the pre-Columbian organization of the watershed. They are not dramatic features, they are subtle ones, readable only to eyes trained to look for them, but they are there, in the landscape, waiting for the research that would integrate them into the full picture of what pre-Columbian North American civilization was. That research is happening. Environmental archaeology, the systematic study of the relationship between ancient human populations and the ecosystems they inhabited, has become one of the most productive areas of inquiry in the study of pre-Columbian North America. The results are consistently showing that the relationship was more intense and more sophisticated than the official story of primeval wilderness suggests. That the continent was not a pristine natural environment untouched by human hands until European contact. That it was a managed landscape, shaped by thousands of years of human activity, organized to maximize the productivity of the most important resources while maintaining the ecological diversity that sustainability required. The peoples who managed it knew what they were doing. They had developed, over the long duration of their relationship with specific landscapes, a knowledge of those landscapes that was deep and reliable and transmitted through exactly the mechanisms that reliable knowledge requires: formal instruction, ceremonial practice, apprenticeship, and the living example of people who had done it before. The knowledge was not individual, it was social, it was institutional. It was the product of the same kind of knowledge-maintaining civilization that produced the mounds and the earthworks and the trade networks and the astronomical alignments. All of it was connected. The agricultural knowledge and the architectural achievement and the astronomical knowledge and the ceremonial tradition and the trade network and the ecological management, these were not separate practices of separate peoples. They were interconnected expressions of civilizations that understood themselves as participants in a larger order, an order that included the sky and the land and the water and the animals and the plants and the other human communities with which they were in relationship. Civilization, in this understanding, was not about the domination of nature. It was about the right relationship with nature. The relationship that produced the abundance and the stability that allowed the other achievements, the architecture and the art and the astronomy, to be built. The first explorers who encountered the remnants of this civilization did not understand it in these terms. Their own civilization was organized around a very different understanding of the relationship between human society and the natural world. The idea that the forest and the soil and the waterways might be the most important expressions of the civilization they were encountering was not available to them in their own cultural frameworks. What they saw as wilderness was actually a managed landscape. What they saw as empty land was actually a fully occupied and actively cultivated territory. What they thought of as the absence of civilization was actually the presence of a different kind of civilization, one that had organized itself around long-term relationship with the land rather than short-term extraction from it. That difference is one of the most important things that the full story of pre-Columbian North American civilization offers to the present. Not as a romantic alternative to modernity, not as a model that can be simply adopted, but as evidence that there are ways of organizing human life in specific places over long periods of time that produce different outcomes than the approach that Western civilization has brought to its relationship with the natural world. Outcomes that in some respects are more sustainable. Outcomes that produce knowledge of a different kind, knowledge of long-term relationship rather than short-term productivity, that may be more useful in the conditions of the 21st century than anything that short-term extraction can produce. The peoples who carry the knowledge are here. They are doing the work of maintaining it and transmitting it and applying it to the challenges of the present. The work is underfunded and under-recognized and complicated by the ongoing consequences of what was done to the civilizations they are the heirs of. But it is happening. It is contributing to conservation and to restoration ecology and to the management of landscapes under conditions of rapid climate change. It is contributing something that the dominant civilization needs and does not yet fully know how to ask for. The conversation is beginning, slowly, unevenly, but beginning. And what it produces, over time, may be among the most important contributions that the long story of pre-Columbian North American civilization makes to whatever comes next. That is the hope that the full story offers. Not nostalgia, not the impossible wish to undo what was done, but the recognition that what survived the catastrophe, what was maintained through everything, has value for the future as well as the past. That the knowledge is not just historical, it is potentially applicable. That the civilizations of pre-Columbian North America left behind not just monuments in earth and stone, but a body of knowledge about how to live in specific places over the long term, that is still alive, still available, still potentially useful. The first explorers were disturbed by what they found. The disturbance was the beginning of a reckoning that has not yet been fully completed. That reckoning is the work of this generation and the next. The work of acknowledging what was here, what was lost, what survived, and what the survival has to offer. It is important work. It is work that this long telling has been circling around, approaching from different directions, trying to capture, in all its complexity and all its humanity. The complexity is real, the humanity is real, and the importance of the work is real. The story of what was here before the first explorers arrived is not a finished story. It is a story that is still being discovered, still being recovered, still being told by the people who are its primary keepers and by the researchers who are their partners in the ongoing project of understanding. It is a story that belongs to this continent and to all the people who live on it. It is a story worth knowing, worth carrying, worth returning to. The mounds are still in their fields and forests. The great houses are still in their canyons. The copper objects are still in their museum cases. The oral traditions are still in the living communities that maintain them through everything. The landscape still carries the marks of thousands of years of human management. The sky still aligns with the monuments that were built to receive it. All of it is still there, patient and heavy and precisely made, saying what it has always been saying to anyone, with the attention and the honesty to hear it. We were here. This was ours. We built this, and we knew this, and we were human here, fully and deeply, long before any explorer set foot on this shore and called it new. It was never new. It was always old. It was always full of human life and human meaning and human achievement, for longer than anyone who set foot on it was prepared to acknowledge. That is the truth the first explorers were disturbed to glimpse. That is the truth the story has been telling in its long, winding, patient way. That is the truth the stones and the earthworks and the traditions and the landscape are still telling to anyone willing to listen. Listen. That is all it asks. Listen, and let what you hear be as full and as honest and as human as it actually is. That is enough. That is more than enough. The night is deep. The mounds are standing. The stars are turning above them. The same stars that were above them when they were built. The same stars they were built to receive. And somewhere in the long, quiet future that the builders were trusting when they set their stones and moved their earth and aligned their structures to the sky, you are here. You arrived. The story reached you. Good night. The last thing that needs to be said, before the night takes this story into whatever keeping the night provides, is something simple. Something that the long journey through all of this complexity might have obscured. Something that the first explorers felt, even through their confusion and their cultural limitations and their failure to fully understand what they were seeing. Something that is still true, and that the evidence of pre-Columbian North American civilization makes vividly and unmistakably clear. Human beings are remarkable. In every time and every place and every environment and every cultural tradition, human beings have been remarkable. They have built things. They have organized themselves. They have looked up at the sky and found it beautiful and meaningful and worthy of their most sustained attention. They have developed knowledge of their specific places in the world, so deep and so carefully maintained that it has in many cases been equal to or superior to what the most sophisticated outside observer could bring to those same places. They have expressed their relationship with the cosmos in stone and in earth and in language and in ceremony, in every medium that was available to them, and in some that required them to invent the medium in order to express what they needed to express. The people who built Cahokia were remarkable. The people who designed the high bank octagon and aligned it to the moonrise at the lunar standstill were remarkable. The people who carried copper from Lake Superior to burial mounds in Ohio were remarkable, not because the act of carrying copper is remarkable, but because it was part of a system of relationships and meanings and values that was remarkable in its scope and in its sophistication. The people who built the great houses of Chaco Canyon and engineered the road system that connected them were remarkable. The people who maintained the salmon runs of the northwest coast with ecological knowledge so sophisticated that Western science is still catching up to it were remarkable. The people who ran the bison jumps and managed the grasslands of the Great Plains for 6,000 years were remarkable. They were remarkable in the way that all human beings are remarkable, not specially, not exceptionally, not as an exception to the general rule of human capacity, but as expressions of what human beings are capable of when they have time and purpose and connection to a specific place and the social structures to transmit their knowledge across generations. The first explorers who found the evidence of this remarkableness disturbing were not responding to something alien. They were responding to something familiar, expressed in forms they had not expected and did not know how to categorize. The disturbance was the disturbance of recognition, of seeing themselves, or something like themselves, in a mirror they had not expected to find. That recognition, imperfect and uncomfortable as it was, is the beginning of the honest account. The account that says, people were here, remarkable people, people who built and organized and knew and expressed and transmitted and achieved, people who were fully human in this place for a very long time before anyone arrived to call it a new world. People whose descendants are here now, carrying forward what survived, doing the work of the recovery, telling their own part of the story in their own ways. The story of pre-Columbian North American civilization is the story of that remarkableness, of what human beings built in this specific place over the specific span of time that they have been in this hemisphere. It is not a simple story. It is not a small story. It is not a story that fits within any comfortable framework of what civilization is supposed to look like. It is the story that the mounds tell, the story that the earthwork enclosures tell, the story that the copper objects and the shell gorgets and the astronomical alignments and the great houses and the road systems tell, the story that the oral traditions tell, the story that the landscape itself, managed and modified and intimately known for thousands of years, tells. It is a story worth knowing, worth carrying, worth returning to, worth spending the long hours of the night with, letting it settle into whatever understanding the night allows. You have been with it for a long time now. You have heard the shape of it, if not every detail. You know something about what was here, something about the depth of the human story on this continent, something about what the first explorers encountered and why it disturbed them, something about what was lost and how it was lost and what survived and what remains. That something is worth having. It is worth more than the simplified version that the official story has offered. And it is a beginning of the longer engagement that the full story invites. The mounds are there, the sites are there, the people are there, the knowledge is there. All of it is available to anyone willing to seek it and to engage with it honestly and to let it be as complicated and as rich as it actually is. The night is the right time for this kind of seeking. The night is the time when the ordinary defenses come down and the mind opens to things that the busy day does not have room for. The long human story of this continent is one of those things. It requires the kind of quiet attention that the night allows. You have given it that attention tonight. That is something. That is the beginning of whatever understanding follows. Sleep now. Let what you have heard settle into whatever form it takes in the mind at rest. Let the mounds stand in your awareness, heavy and patient and precisely made. Let the stars turn above them. Let the long story of the people who built them, and the people who came after them, and the people who are here now, carrying it all forward, continue in the background of whatever the night brings. It will still be there when you wake. The story is always there, patient as stone, long as the night, true as the sky. Good night. There is a sound that the Mississippi River makes at night, below Street, Louis, in the section where the current runs swift, and the banks are dark, and the lights of any human settlement are far enough away that the river seems, briefly, to belong to itself. It is not a loud sound. It is the sound of moving water over deep sediment, a soft, continuous sound that has no beginning and no end, that was making this sound long before any of the towns along its banks existed, and that will be making it long after. It is a sound that belongs to the deep time of the continent, to the time before the explorers and the settlements and the mounds, and even before the people who built the mounds. The river was here first. The river will be here last. The Mississippians who built Cahokia on the bluffs above the Mississippi's floodplain heard that sound. The Hopewell people who traveled the Ohio and the Illinois and the Tennessee on their way to and from the great ceremonial centers heard it. The people who traveled the coast of the continent 14,000 years ago, following the kelp beds and the salmon runs, heard the sound of moving water everywhere they went. The sound is old. The human relationship with it is old. The civilization that developed in response to it, that organized itself around the rivers and the resources they carry, is old. That oldness is what this telling has been about. The oldness of the human story on this continent, the depth of the civilization that developed here, in the long, slow time between the first human arrivals and the moment when the European ships arrived and began the process that changed everything. The depth that the first explorers glimpsed and found disturbing, and that we are still, 5 centuries later, in the process of fully acknowledging. The acknowledgement is happening. It will keep happening. The evidence is too abundant and too consistent to be permanently ignored. The living peoples too present and too persistent to be disappeared from the story. the mounds too enduring to be ploughed under entirely. However, many of them have been lost. The traditions too deep-rooted to be eliminated. However, many generations of suppression were directed at them. What was here is still here, in different forms, transformed by catastrophe and by survival and by the long work of rebuilding that the peoples of this continent have been engaged in since the moment the catastrophe began. But still here, still recognizable, still carrying the essential character of the civilizations from which it came. The essential character is the relationship, the deep, long-term, carefully maintained relationship between human communities and the specific places they have inhabited. The knowledge that comes from that relationship, the ceremony that honors it, the construction that expresses it, the oral tradition that transmits it, the ecological management that sustains it, all of it expressions of the fundamental commitment to being in right relationship with the world, to understanding one's place in the larger order, to participating in the ongoing project of maintaining the conditions that make human life possible and meaningful. That commitment is what the mounds express, not the ambition of rulers, though rulers built them, not the labor of coerced workers, though workers built them, but the commitment of communities to the relationship that defined them, to the sky they aligned their buildings to the dead they buried with care, to the future they trusted with the permanence of earth. The future is here. You are here. The mounds are standing. The relationship is still available to anyone who comes to it with the attention it deserves. Come to it, whenever you can, in whatever form works for you, in the physical presence of the sites that survive, in the scholarship that is recovering the full story, in the living communities that are the primary keepers of the tradition, in the quiet hours of the night when the mind opens to what the day does not have room for. Come to it. The story is there, the stones are there, the sky is there, and the long human story of this continent, in all its depth and complexity and humanity, is there too, waiting, as it has always waited, patient as stone, long as the river, true as the stars. Sleep now, it will still be there. Good night. In the morning, if you remember any of this, let it be the simplest part, not the names of the sites, not the specific dates, not the complex arguments about founding populations and trade networks and institutional frameworks. Let it be the feeling of standing in front of something that human beings made a very long time ago with great care and great knowledge and great intention. The feeling of the gap between what you thought was here and what was actually here beginning to close. The gap is closing. Slowly, unevenly, incompletely, but closing. And each time someone hears this story and carries it forward, each time someone brings their attention to what was here, each time someone treats the peoples who are the inheritors of this civilization with the respect and the recognition they deserve, the gap closes a little more. That is enough. That is more than enough. The mounds are standing, the traditions are alive, the people are here. And the story, long and patient and true, goes on. Good night. There is one last image to hold, one final picture to carry into whatever the night becomes. It is an image of a mound, not Monk's Mound, with its enormous scale and its UNESCO designation and its visitor center, a smaller one of the hundreds of ordinary mounds that are still standing in the river valleys of the eastern United States, unexcavated, uninterpreted, unvisited by the buses and the guided tours and the scholarly conferences. A mound that sits in the edge of a field, surrounded by trees that have grown up around it over the past century, their roots threading down through the soil that the people who built the mound moved by hand, basket by basket, over however many seasons of labor the building required. The mound is overgrown. It does not look dramatic. It does not announce itself. It is simply a rise in the ground, gentle and rounded, the product of human intention and human labor, made indistinguishable by time from the natural topography around it. Someone who did not know to look for it would walk past it without stopping. But it is there. It has been there for 1,000 years, or 2,000 years. It has survived the ploughing and the development, and the indifference, and the occasional deliberate destruction. It is still, in its quiet and overgrown state, exactly what it was built to be. The physical expression of someone's commitment to a place and a sky and a community and a moment in time that mattered enough to mark it in earth and carry the mark forward to whatever future was coming. You are the future that was coming. Specifically you, in this specific moment, wherever you are. They built for you, not knowing who you would be, not knowing what the world would look like when you arrived, but trusting that you would be here, and that the mark would still be visible, and that the connection between their moment and yours was worth making in something that would last. The connection is made, the mound is there, the earth holds what it has always held, and you know, now, something of what it means, something of who built it and why and what they were part of, something of what was lost and what survived, something of what the story is that the mound has been carrying, patiently and quietly, in the edge of its field for all the years it has been standing there. That something is the inheritance, not the mound itself, which belongs to the land and to the people whose ancestors built it, but the knowledge of what it means, the willingness to see it for what it is, the capacity to feel, across the distance of 1,000 years, the human intention that is still present in the shape of the earth. That capacity is what makes us human. Not the buildings, though the buildings are remarkable, not the trade networks or the astronomical knowledge or the ecological management, but the capacity to reach across time and to recognize, in the work of people who lived and died long before us, something that is still alive and still meaningful and still worth attending to. You attended. That is the whole of what was asked. The night is deep, the mound is standing, the sky is turning above it, and somewhere in the long human story that stretches back across everything this telling has described, and forward into whatever comes next, there is a connection. A thin, quiet, almost invisible thread connecting the moment when someone packed earth and carried it to that rise in the ground and shaped it into something permanent, and this moment, when you are here, knowing something of what that effort meant. The thread holds, it has always held, it is what stories are made of, and what stone endures to protect. Sleep well. The mound is standing. The thread holds. That is everything. Good night. Before you sleep, a small thing. Not a summary, not a conclusion, just a small, quiet observation about what it means to have spent time with a story like this one. The story of pre-Columbian North American civilization is not comfortable. It asks things of the listener that comfortable stories do not ask. It asks for the willingness to revise assumptions, to sit with complexity, to hold the evidence honestly even when the evidence is inconvenient, to recognize achievement in forms that the default frameworks were not built to recognize, to acknowledge loss in ways that implicate the history of the country and the continent you are living in. None of that is easy. All of it is worth doing. You did some of it tonight. In the hours you gave to this telling, you did the small, quiet, genuinely important work of paying attention to what was here, of letting the story be as big and as complicated and as human as it is, of staying with it long enough for some of it to settle into something more than information. That is not nothing. In a world that is full of distractions and simplifications and stories designed to confirm what you already believe rather than expand it, the willingness to sit with something complicated and let it change your understanding is a genuine act. A small one, but genuine. Carry what you can. Let the rest settle into whatever the sleep allows. The mounds will still be standing when you wake. The traditions will still be alive. The people will still be doing the work of the recovery, on their own terms, in their own time. And the story will still be there, long and patient and true, waiting for the next person who needs it. Good night. Rest well. The river is still running. Below St. Louis, below Cairo, below Memphis, below Natchez and Baton Rouge, the Mississippi is still running to the Gulf, making the sound it has always made, carrying the sediment of the continent in its current, passing the bluffs where Cahokia stood, passing the floodplains where the corn once grew in the fields of a civilization that has no name in any language currently spoken, but that left its mark on the earth as surely as anything in human history. The river does not remember, but the earth remembers. The soil remembers. The shape of the mounds remembers. The alignment of the stones remembers. The oral traditions remember. And now, a little, so do you. That is enough. That is what a night like this one is for. Good night. The river is running. The story is there. Rest now. The night holds all of this. The long human story of this continent. The mounds and the earthworks and the great houses and the road systems. The copper and the shell and the mica and the obsidian, traded across a continent by people whose names we do not know. The astronomical alignments, still pointing at the moments in the sky that someone found worth marking. The oral traditions, still carried by living peoples through everything. The landscape itself, patient and modified and still bearing the marks of its long human history. All of it held by the night, available to whoever comes looking with the honesty and the attention it deserves. You came looking, you stayed. That is the whole of what was asked, and you gave it. Sleep well. Good night.